3-meter-tall women wielding bone blades patrolled the hall. 80 men were flexing their strength before the tournament, where only 3 would survive. And a former crisis psychologist from Earth looked at his glowing palm and bet all his points on whatever everyone here was laughing at. A second later, the interface flashed and displayed lines that no one else could see. A chill pierced his spine. Dan Carver's eyes flew open. The metal floor hummed beneath him. The ceiling hung 20 meters above, glowing a dead blue. He was lying in a puddle of something sticky and warm. People are standing all around him. Or rather, no, not all of them are people. Dan sits up and sees a line. 80 men are lined up in rows of 10. People, creatures with gray scales, lanky creatures with 4 arms. All of them are staring intently at their palms. A blue interface flickers on the back of each one. 6 lines. Attack, defense, speed, psi, stamina, charisma. 20 free points. A voice booms from above in a foreign language, but the implant in his temple translates with a delay. Everyone has received the gift of becoming. Allocate your points. Then the tournament of virtue will begin.
The best will be chosen. Dan isn't listening. He's staring intently at the creatures patrolling the perimeter of the hall.
Women. 3 meters tall. Their skin has a bronze sheen. Bone blades as long as an arm grow from their forearms. They move like predators. Smoothly. Without a single unnecessary movement. Any one of them could tear him in half with one hand and not even notice. Dan shifts his gaze to the interface. Then back to the patrols. Then to the men. The gray-scaled bruiser next to him maxes out attack and defense. The skinny 4-armed one maxes out speed. Everyone's getting ready to fight. Now imagine 7 years on the job where every day someone's standing on the edge of a roof. For 7 years, Dan has been pulling people back from the edge, calming veterans in the throes of a flashback. He diffused situations where knives were flying through the air. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know what psi is. He doesn't know if he'll make it to morning. But he knows one thing. When you're surrounded by armed monsters at the peak of stress, you don't need attack. You need them to listen to you. Dan raises his hand and pours all 20 points into charisma.
The interface flashes. It flashes again.
Lines he's never seen before race across the screen. Something about hidden protocols, about resonance. The text fades faster than the implant can translate it. The hulking peeks over his shoulder and roars with laughter, the echo reverberating through the hall. Dan has signed up for the first Berserker's favorite game. With stats like that, they won't even let him into the tournament. He'll just be cannon fodder for entertainment. Laughter ripples through the rows. Even the Zerani patrolmen turn their heads. Dan shrugs. He replies quietly, "Maybe. Or maybe this is the first decision in a long time that he's confident about." The Chaldean clams up. Whatever it is in Dan's voice that naturally stifles the laughter. Not a threat. Not force. Just the absolute calm of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. Or is pretending very convincingly. The distribution hall at Kolot Prime Station operates by its own rules. Men sleep on the floor in groups of 20 per sector. Food is thrown out twice a day. Tasteless gray briquettes. Water trickles from the faucets in the wall, but there's a line at each one, and people fight in the lines.
For 6 hours, Dan just watches. The Chaldeans stick together in a pack. 5 burly lizardmen have claimed the best spot by the wall and won't let anyone near it. People have gathered in groups of 3 or 4, based on whoever saw whom first. The 4-armed Shars sit apart. A quiet war is already smoldering between the groups. Over a spot by the wall. Over the line for water. Over a patch of floor out of the draft. Dan has seen it all before. In shelters. In flop houses. In Portland's crisis centers. A different scale. The same rules. Fear breeds aggression. Aggression breeds hierarchy. Hierarchy breeds violence. And one person can break this cycle. Give people something other than fear. At 8 o'clock, Dan gets up and walks over to the Chaldean who had been laughing at him. His name is Gore. Dan sits down next to him without being invited. Gore tenses up. Scales bristle along his spine. A threat signal. Dan reads it. And sees something else. Gore hasn't clenched his fists. His eyes dart from side to side. Behind the bravado hides a man who has no idea what tomorrow will bring. Dan asks calmly, Does Gore know what happens after the tournament? Gore is silent. Then he says, almost through gritted teeth, after the tournament, they sort us out. The female warriors choose those who've scored the most points. The rest are sent to workstations, mines, farms, waste processing. Only a handful return. Dan nods. He asks how many out of 80 are usually chosen. Gore holds up 3 fingers. 3 out of 80. 4 in a good year. Dan scans the room. 80 men. Each one is leveling up attack and defense. Each one is preparing to fight for one of the 3 spots. 77 will lose. And not a single one has asked themselves a simple question. What if fighting isn't the only way? Dan remains silent. It's not time yet. He thanks Gore and returns to his spot. He lies down on the floor. He closes his eyes. And he begins to map things out in his head. Names. Faces. Who's talking to whom? Who's afraid of whom? Who's keeping to himself? Who's hiding a tremor behind his fists? 20,000 hours of practice. 7 years of crisis response. He does this in his sleep. Literally. On the second day, Dan's world fell apart. He woke up to a sound unlike anything he'd ever experienced before, a low, guttural howl at a frequency that made his bones vibrate. He opened his eyes. The men around him jumped up and scurried toward the walls. In the center of the sector stood a young Zerani, 2 meters 80. Her skin was ashen gray. Bony blades grew from her forearms, but unevenly. One was longer than the other. Both were covered in cracks, an incomplete mutation. Her eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, 2 gaping voids. She howled and spun in place. A single swing of her arm. A Caldis who hadn't managed to run away was hurled into the wall. A crunch. He didn't get up. A second swing. The floor where the Shar had been standing a second ago split open with a crack as wide as an elbow. Berserk. Dan had heard that word in the translation of the instructions, but hadn't fully understood it. Now he understood. The warrior had lost control of her mutation. Her body was changing right before his eyes. The blades were growing. Her skin was bursting and regenerating. She wasn't attacking deliberately. She was simply smashing everything around her because the pain was unbearable. 4 patrolmen leaped from the balcony above the hall, 3 meters tall, bronze-skinned, with plasma spears at the ready. They formed a semicircle. The senior officer raised her spear and aimed the glowing tip at the berserker's chest. 1 strike. Clean. Fast. Protocol. Dan had seen this protocol before. Not here. In Portland. When police officers aimed their weapons at a person in a psychotic state. When the decision had already been made. When no one was trying to talk anymore. He'd seen it 30 times. 8 of those 30 times, he'd managed to intervene. 4 times, it had saved a life. His body moved before his mind could say, stop. He stepped out from behind the backs of the men crawling away. He walked past the semicircle of patrol officers. The sergeant barked something. The implant translated it a split second too late. She was ordering him to turn back or die. Dan didn't stop. He looked at the berserker, at her stance. She stood hunched over, her hands pressed against her chest. Her blades pointed downward, not outward, downward. She wasn't attacking. She was defending herself. From pain, from fear, from everything at once. Dan knew that stance. He'd seen it on the rooftops of Portland. A person who wants to inflict pain on others stands differently. This person wanted the pain to stop, at any cost. He sat down on the floor, slowly, without any sudden movements. He crossed his legs. He placed his hands on his knees, palms up, an open stance. No threat, no challenge. He made himself lower than her, much lower, a small, soft lump on the floor. Helpless, harmless. The berserker turned her black eyes toward him. The howl grew quieter. It didn't stop, but it was quieter. She could see him. Dan spoke, quietly, so quietly that the men 20 paces behind him couldn't hear his words. He said her name wasn't Unit 64, that she had a name. He asked her to say it, just say it. The warrior blinked. The blackness in her eyes flinched. Somewhere beneath the layers of pain, mutation, and rage, there was still someone alive. Someone who remembered her name. She opened her mouth. A rasp escaped her throat. Then another. Then the sound took shape as a word. Kirsha. She said her name was Kirsha. A black tear trickled down her cheek, not an ordinary one, thick, glowing with a dim violet light, a bioluminescent toxin. The implant prompted him. The Ziranis secreted in times of extreme grief. Dan nodded. He said, "Hello, Kirsha." He said his name was Dan. He said he wouldn't go anywhere until she was breathing calmly. And he really didn't go anywhere. 4 minutes. He sat on the floor and breathed. Steadily. Slowly. A deep inhale. A slow exhale. An old trick from crisis intervention. A person in panic unconsciously adjusts their breathing to match that of someone nearby. If someone nearby is breathing calmly, the body begins to mimic it. The Zir'ani weren't human, but they had breathing, and a nervous system, and millions of years of evolution that had taught their bodies to respond to calm with calm. After a minute, the darkness in Kirshi's eyes began to recede. After 2, she stopped howling. After 3, her knees buckled. After 4, she was lying at his feet. She was asleep. Black tears still streamed down her cheeks, but her breathing was steady. The distribution hall stood in complete silence. 80 men. 4 patrolmen with plasma spears. Everyone was looking at the thin man on the floor next to the sleeping berserker. The Gore Chaldean stood with his mouth agape. His scales lay flat. Not a trace of bravado. The senior patrolwoman slowly lowered her spear. She looked at Dan as if she were seeing something impossible. Because it was impossible. No one had ever spoken to a berserker. They were killed. Always. From a balcony above the hall, another Zir'ani watched it all unfold. 3 meters 40. Her bronze skin bore golden patterns that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Bioluminescence. A sign of high rank. For the past 200 years, none of her subordinates had seen anything on her face but cold indifference. Now it bore an expression that her guards would only recognize after consulting the historical archives. Curiosity. The Supreme Inquisitor of the Kolot Weltar clan looked down at the small man and, for the first time in a very long time, didn't know what to think. This intrigued her. 6 hours after the incident with Kirsha, they came for Dan. 2 guards, each 3 meters tall. Bronze skin. Plasma spears. They didn't bother to explain. One grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the floor like a kitten. Dan's feet dangled 30 centimeters above the ground. They carried him across the hall, past the silent men, past Gore, who watched him go, past Kier, who was sleeping on the floor in the medical sector under the watch of a drone. The corridors of Kolot Prime Station were built for beings twice Dan's size. 5-meter-high ceilings. Doors wide enough for a truck to drive through. Walls of dark metal covered with patterns that, upon closer inspection, turned out to be text. Thousands of lines of small print carved directly into the metal. Laws. Rules. Hierarchies. The entire world of the Zir'ani was literally inscribed on the walls. He was brought into a room on the upper level. The room was large by human standards and cramped by Zir'ani standards. 1 table, 2 chairs. 1 chair was ordinary. The other was the size of a small throne. Seated on the throne was Tara. 3 meters 40. Bronze skin. Golden bioluminescent patterns stretched from her cheekbones down her neck and further under the collar of her uniform jacket. Her hands were folded on the table. Dan could see that both hands had been broken and set many times. Her knuckles were knobby. Her joints were thickened. These were hands that had worked. A lot. Hard. The guard lowered Dan onto a small stool. He ended up at the level of her stomach. She looked down at him. Silently. 20 seconds. 30. A minute. Dan waited. He didn't fidget. He didn't try to speak first. He didn't look away. He just sat there and breathed. That too was part of the job. Whoever spoke first would reveal their need. And Dan needed her to be the one to show that need. Tara spoke at the 3-minute mark. The implant translated with slight delays, but the meaning was clear. She said she'd watched the recording of the incident 32 times. That she'd analyzed his every movement, every posture, the tone of his voice, the rhythm of his breathing. She said that in 47 service cycles, she had interrogated more than 4,000 beings, and not a single one of them had behaved the way he did. She asked what he had done with the berserker. Dan thought for a second. Then he told the truth. He said he'd talk to her. Well, Tara blinked. Her golden patterns flashed brighter for a split second. Then they dimmed back to their usual level. She said that they don't talk to berserkers, that a berserker is the end, that the mutation takes over the brain and the person dies, that the only protocol is a quick death. It had always been that way. Dan nodded. He said he understood why they thought that way. He said that in his world too, there were people in states where everyone around them considered them lost. People in psychosis. People on the edge. People who screamed and destroyed everything around them. And for a long time, they too were simply stopped by force, until someone tried to talk to them. Well, Tara was silent for a long time. Her fingers moved on the table, barely noticeable. Dan watched them. The index finger of her right hand tapped the tabletop. The rhythm was uneven, not nervous, thoughtful. She was processing the information. She asked if he could do it again. Dan said he didn't know. He said that every case was different, that not every berserker could be brought back, that he might make a mistake and die. He didn't lie. He didn't exaggerate his abilities. Well, Tara tilted her head. The patterns on her cheekbones flashed 3 times. Dan didn't know what it meant, but he remembered it. She said that berserk incidents at the station occur 4 or 5 times per decade. That over the last cycle, the Kolot clan had lost 47 female warriors in a berserk state. All had been killed according to protocol. She said this in an even voice. But her index finger paused. It froze on the tabletop. It pressed against the surface. The knuckle turned white. 47. Dan heard the number, saw the finger, and understood. To her, these weren't just statistics. Dan asked quietly. He asked if there were any among the 47 whom she knew personally. Well, Tara didn't answer. But her patterns faded completely. For 2 seconds, she sat before him like a bronze statue without light. Expressionless. Motionless. Then the light returned. She stood up. 3 meters 40 above the floor. She recited a formula that the implant translated as a legal declaration. She was taking him into her custody. Officially, to study anomalous behavior during the tournament. Unofficially, Dan already understood why. She didn't need a subject for study. She needed someone who could look at her and see not the Supreme Inquisitor, not a rank, not a title, not 47 dead names and reports, but her. Dan stood up from his chair. He came up to her waist. He said thank you. She said that gratitude had no tactical value. Dan said it shouldn't. Well, Tara looked down at him. The patterns flashed, once, brightly, and Dan could have sworn that something resembling the shadow of a smile twitched at the corner of her mouth. They put him in a cubbyhole next to her office. 2 meters by 3. A cot, a sink, a window in the wall through which he could see the cargo hold below. It was the best room he'd lived in since arriving in this world. On the second night, Kirsha came to his door. She stood in the hallway. Ash gray. Normal eyes. Yellow with vertical pupils. The blades on her shoulders were still bent and cracked. She said nothing. She just stood there. Dan opened the door and asked if she wanted to come in. She shook her head. Then she said one word. Kirtan. The implant translated it. Shield Sister. An ancient title. Zir-Ani who voluntarily binds her life to the protection of another being. An irrevocable vow. Dan said he couldn't accept that it was too much, that he was just an ordinary person. Kirsha looked at him with her yellow eyes and said that he was the first person to ask her name, that in 24 life cycles, no one had ever once asked what her name was, that in the Asara clan, she was Unit 6-4, a number, a defective mutant, a byproduct of the awakening. And he sat down on the floor in front of her, in front of her, and asked her name. She said her life was already his. The only question was whether he would accept it or whether she would stand in the hallway for the rest of her days. Dan closed his eyes. Inside him, the crisis negotiator was screaming a red alert. You must not accept affection from people you've pulled out of a crisis. They confuse rescue with love, gratitude with devotion. That's a basic rule of ethics. He opened his eyes and looked at Kirsha. 2 meters 80, cracked blades, a scar on her neck. Yellow eyes filled with such quiet determination that his throat tightened. He wasn't in Portland. There was no ethics committee here. There was no system here to protect this girl if he said no. Here, there was only cold steel and the law of the jungle. And if he pushed her away, she would be left alone in a world that considered her trash. He stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. She entered. She sat down on the floor near his cot. She wrapped her knees with her hands. She closed her eyes. A minute later, she was asleep. Dan sat down next to her on the floor. He leaned his back against the wall, and he thought that in 2 days in this world, he had managed to become something he never intended to be: someone's home. Dan spent his first week on 3 things: the language, the map, and survival. The Zirani language implant translated with mixed results. Every 3rd word was lost. Every 5th was translated incorrectly. Dan realized this when he tried to thank Weltara for the food, and the implant translated it as a ritual acknowledgement of vassalage. Weltara raised an eyebrow. Dan spent the next hour explaining that, no, he wasn't acknowledging vassalage. He just wanted to thank her for the soup. From that day on, he began learning the language the hard way. Kirsha became his teacher, or rather, his shadow, who would occasionally speak the words. She wasn't talkative, but she was patient. Dan would point at an object. She would name it. He would repeat it. She would correct him. By the end of the first week, he could say 90 words without the implant. Water, food, door, wall, danger, name, pain, silence, stand, sit, listen. It wasn't enough for a conversation, but it was enough to survive. He was mapping it out in his head. Kolat Prime Station was enormous. 16 levels. The top 4 for command and the elite. The middle 6 for the military personnel. The bottom 6 for support staff and infrastructure. And beneath it all, abandoned sections that no one had used for dozens of cycles. Dan memorized the routes. Who went where? At what times? Which corridors emptied out at night? Where the cameras were? Where the blind spots were? It wasn't paranoia, it was a habit. In Portland, he'd worked in neighborhoods where knowing which streets to avoid at what time of day meant the difference between keeping your ribs intact or having them broken. Survival was the hardest part. Not physically. Physically, Dan was simply tiny and fragile in a world of giants. You can get used to that. The challenge was social. Kolat Prime Station was a military facility. Warrior women lived here. Each of them had grown up in a culture where strength determined everything. The right to speak, the right to eat first, the right to exist. A man in this world was something between a pet and a necessary evil. He wasn't respected, they tolerated him. Dan felt it every time he walked down the hallway. The female warriors looked down on him, literally. Some with curiosity, some with indifference, some with something he could only describe as hunger. He'd learned to walk alongside Kirsha. She was smaller than the others, a reject. But she was a Zirani, and he was under her protection. That changed the way they looked at him. Not everyone, but enough. On the 4th day, Weltara summoned him. She was sitting at her desk. Holograms lay before her. Medical data. Dan couldn't read the text but recognized the format. He'd seen similar things in hospitals. Brain scans, blood tests, biometrics. Weltara said this was data on berserk incidents over the last 10 cycles. 300 cases in the Kolat clan alone. All had ended in death. She said the frequency was rising. 20 cases per cycle 3 years ago, 32 last cycle, 47 this cycle. A progression. Something is changing, something is breaking, and no one knows why. She asked if he had any theories. Dan looked at the data. He didn't understand Zirani medicine. He didn't know their biology. He couldn't read the metrics. But he could ask a question. He asked who most often went berserk. Weltara answered. Young female warriors, aged 18 to 30 cycles, the period after awakening. Dan asked if there was a connection to the results of awakening. Weltara pulled up another hologram. She frowned. She said that 70% of berserkers are female warriors with an incomplete or unstable awakening. Those who received a weak mutation, or an incorrect one, or a painful one. Dan nodded slowly. 70%. Young. With failed mutations. In a society where mutation determines rank and rank determines value. He asked one more question. He asked what happens to a female warrior after a failed awakening, how she's treated, how people speak to her. Weltara opened her mouth to answer and paused. Her patterns flickered. She looked at Dan, then at the holograms, then back at Dan. She said they aren't spoken to, that they're demoted in rank, transferred to service positions, cut off from their combat sisters. That for the Zirani, this is worse than physical pain, because their race is social. Their nervous system requires connection, contact, recognition from the pack. Without it, they slowly fall apart. Dan said one sentence. He said that the Berserker Plague isn't a physical illness. It's a disease of loneliness. Weltara was silent for a minute. Her golden patterns glowed steadily. No flickering, no pulsing, just a steady light. Dan had already learned what that meant. She was thinking, seriously, deeply. Then she said that if he was right, it changed everything, and that if he was wrong, she would lose another 50 warriors in the next cycle. Dan said he wanted to try. He needed a room, a small one, quiet, no cameras, no weapons, a place where the warriors could come and just be. No ranks, no protocols, no expectations. Weltara asked why. Dan said that in his world, it's called a crisis center, a place where people go when they have no one to call at 3 in the morning. The implant couldn't translate the word call, Dan explained with gestures. Weltara looked at him for a long time. Then she said there was an abandoned infirmary on the lower levels. It hadn't been used for 20 cycles. It could be converted. Dan smiled. For the first time since arriving in this world, he said that was enough. On the 5th day, he and Kirsha went down to the lower levels. The infirmary was in a section the station had long since decommissioned. Dim light, rust on the walls, dust a finger's thickness. 12 beds, an operating room with broken equipment, and one large room with a low ceiling. There was nothing in it. Bare walls, bare floor, silence. Dan stood in the center of the room. He closed his eyes. He listened. The silence was real. Not a dead silence, but a living one, the kind where you could hear someone's breath. He opened his eyes and said to Kirsha, "Here." She asked what was here. He said this would be the quiet room. Kirsha didn't understand. She asked what a quiet room was. Dan thought about how to explain it. Then he said simply, "It's a place where you can be weak and no one will kill you for it." Kirsha stood in silence. Then she sat down on the floor. She leaned her back against the wall. She closed her eyes. A minute later, a black tear rolled down her cheek again, but not from grief, from the fact that, for the first time in her life, someone had said out loud what she needed most of all. A place where you can be weak. Dan sat down next to her. They sat in silence. Two beings from different worlds. One tiny, the other with cracks in her blades. Both broken, both right where they belonged. And the quiet room came into being. Kirsha was the first to enter the quiet room. She had been nearby all along. That didn't count. The second to arrive was a guard named Tyre Os. 3 meters 10, bronze skin with gray spots on her neck. A mutation. Adaptive skin armor. It was supposed to cover her entire body but stopped at her throat. Incomplete. Just like Kirsha's. Tyre Os arrived on the 8th day. She stood in the doorway. She was silent. Dan sat in the corner on a cushion he'd snatched from the cargo hold. He didn't stand up. He didn't speak. He didn't invite her in. He just kept sitting there. Kirsha was next to him, cleaning her blades. Or rather, trying to. The cracks wouldn't budge. But the process was soothing. Tyre Os stood in the doorway for 4 minutes. Then she took a step inside. Then another. Then she sat down against the opposite wall, as far away from Dan as possible, and just sat there for 20 minutes without saying a word. Then she stood up and left. The next day she came back. Again, she sat against the far wall. Again, she remained silent, but this time she sat for 30 minutes. On the 3rd day, she sat a little closer. On the 4th day, she spoke. She said she hadn't slept for 11 days, that every time she closed her eyes, she saw her barrack sister go berserk, and how she herself thrust a spear into her back, following protocol. That it had been 4 decades ago. That her sister's name was Ion Kai. That no one had uttered that name since then. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened. When she finished, he said one thing. Ion Kai. He repeated the name aloud. Clearly, calmly, as if that name deserved to be spoken. Tyre Os looked at him. The gray patches on her neck flared white. The implant didn't explain what that meant, but Kirsha, standing nearby, shuddered quietly. It meant something important. Tyre Os left. The next day, She brought 2 friends. By the end of the second week, 12 Zirani were coming to the quiet room. Regularly. Every day. Not all of them spoke. Some just sat there. Some slept. One came and drew on the wall with charcoal, strange spirals and jagged lines. Dan didn't ask what they were. She told him herself on her 4th visit. They were faces. The faces of those she had lost. She drew them so she wouldn't forget. Dan offered her a separate wall. She looked at him as if he'd offered her a planet. Then she nodded and began drawing faster. By the end of the 3rd week, the entire left wall of the quiet room was covered with faces. Hundreds of faces. Charcoal on metal. Rough. Uneven. But each with a name at the bottom. Dan looked at that wall and understood. The Zirani didn't know how to grieve. They had no word for it. The implant translated the closest equivalent as weakness after loss. They didn't bury the dead. They recycled the bodies into biomaterial. Efficiently. Rationally. Without ritual. Without farewells. Without names. And all that unprocessed pain built up inside like pressure in a boiler. Generation after generation. 300 years of war. 300 years of losses that no one had mourned. The Berserker Plague was not a mutation that had spiraled out of control. It was the boiler exploding. The body of a Zirani, no longer able to contain the grief, tore itself apart from within. Dan wrote this thought on the wall next to the faces. He scratched it out with a stylus from a broken medical terminal. In English, because his written Zirani was even worse than his spoken. He wrote, "Grief without a name becomes an illness. An illness without a cure becomes madness. Madness without a witness becomes death." The next day, Weltara went down to the quiet room for the first time. She barely fit through the doorway. 3 meters 40 in a room with a ceiling 360. She had to tilt her head. She saw a wall covered with faces. She froze. Her patterns faded completely. She stood there for a minute, 2. Then she walked over to the wall and ran her finger over one of the faces. The lower right corner. A young face with 4 eyes. She said a name. Karen Soul. Her voice was steady, but her finger on the wall was trembling. Dan didn't ask who Karen Soul was. He could already tell, from the way Weltara touched the drawing with her fingertips. Gently, as if touching something fragile, something that could be lost twice. Weltara turned to him. She looked down at him. Her face was blank, but the patterns on her cheekbones glowed so brightly that Dan could have read by their light. She said he was dangerous, that he did things that were impossible to control, that the quiet room wasn't a room but a weapon, and that she didn't know what to do about it. Dan said that he understood. He said that a place where people are allowed to feel always frightens those who are used to forbidding it. Weltara said she wasn't afraid. Dan remained silent. He saw her little finger, her left hand, the second phalanx, a barely perceptible tremor. She was afraid. Not of him, of herself. By what she felt when she saw Karen Soul's face on the wall. By the fact that this feeling was still alive after so many years. She left without saying goodbye. The next day, she sent a batch of pillows to the quiet room. 30 of them. No note. No explanation. Dan smiled and spread them out on the floor. The quiet room was filling up. Pillows. Warm blankets that someone had slipped in at night. An old white noise generator that Kersha had found in the trash chute and fixed with 2 wires and a piece of insulation tape. Drawings on the walls. First on 1. Then on 2. Then on all 4. Names. Faces. Stories. One Zirani brought a piece of mineral from her home planet. She placed it in the corner. She said it was a stone from her mother's garden, that her mother had died in the war against the Devourers 7 cycles ago, that the garden had long since been destroyed, that the stone was all that remained. Dan asked her mother's name. Zirani said the name. Dan repeated it. Zirani looked at him, then at the stone. Then she said quietly that for the first time in 7 cycles, someone had spoken that name aloud. She came the next day with 3 friends. They all brought stones. By the middle of the 3rd week, a small mountain of mineral stones, shards, each with a name, each with a story. Dan called it the Wall of Remembrance to himself. He didn't explain to Zerani what a memorial was. He didn't lecture her on the culture of mourning. He simply spoke the names they told him, aloud, clearly, respectfully. And that was enough. Because in a world where the dead were recycled and names were forgotten, the very act of saying a name was an act of such impossible tenderness that the 3-meter-tall warrior women didn't know how to react to it, except to come back again, and to bring a friend. On the 21st day, Weltara summoned him upstairs. She said that the command had found out about the quiet room, that it had caught their attention, that among those who had taken notice were people who considered it a threat to order, that Dan needed to be prepared for the fact that they would try to shut down his project. Dan asked who exactly considered it a threat. Weltara gave one name, Zorkane the Unyielding, the great matriarch of the Dryhand clan, the most warlike of the 7 matriarchs of the cluster, a mother whom her daughters fear more than the Devourers. Dan recorded the name in his mental map. A new node, red, dangerous. He asked Weltara how much time he had. She said she didn't know. Maybe a decade, maybe 3, maybe tomorrow. Dan nodded. He said that in that case he'd better work faster. He returned to the quiet room. He sat down on a cushion. Kirsha sat down next to him. 12 Zerani sat along the walls, silent, breathing, alive. Dan looked at them, at the faces on the walls, at the stones in the corner, and thought that if this was a weapon, it was the quietest weapon he had ever seen. On the 23rd day, Yorain entered the quiet room. Dan didn't know who she was. He saw a girl who was short by Zerani standards, 2 meters 50, azure skin. 4 extra eyes on her temples, small, yellow-green. They moved independently of the 2 main ones, constantly, as if scanning everything around them. She barged through the doorway unlike the others. Not quietly, not cautiously. She stormed in. She tripped over a pillow. She cursed in Zerani so fast that her implant broke on the 3rd word. Then she saw Dan. She froze. She looked at him with all 6 eyes at once. And she started talking so fast that Dan's head began to ache. She said she'd heard about him, that the whole station had heard about him, that she'd come not because she was feeling sick, but because she was curious, that she was an engineer and a mechanic and needed to understand how he did it. She said she'd studied the footage of the incident with Kirsha frame by frame, that she'd analyzed his biometrics from the surveillance cameras, that his pulse at the moment of de-escalation was 62 beats per minute. 62. For a human, facing a berserker. She said it was either a pathology or that he was the most cold-blooded creature she'd ever met, and that she wanted to know which of the 2 it was. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she paused to take a breath, he seized the moment. He asked her name. She faltered. She blinked all 6 of her eyes, not all at once, but in waves. First the main ones, then the side ones. She said her name was Yorain, of the Dryhand clan. When Dan heard the clan name, something inside him clicked. Dryhand, the clan of Zorkane the Unbending, the very one who had wanted to close the quiet room. He looked at Yorain more closely. Azure skin, 4 extra eyes. She was small for a Zerani, too small. 250 compared to the clan standard of over 3 meters. Her mutation had manifested in her senses rather than in size and strength. 6 eyes instead of 2. This gave her a 360-degree field of view and the ability to see in the infrared spectrum. Useful for an engineer, useless for a warrior. In the Dryhand clan, where brute strength was valued, she was an anomaly. He asked why she wasn't in her own clan. Yorain fell silent. For the first time in 3 minutes, the silence lasted 5 seconds. For her, it felt like an eternity. Then she said she'd been sent here on a mission, to observe him, to gather data, to report back. She said it plainly, without any pretense. Dan wasn't surprised. He asked if she intended to carry out the mission. Yorain paused for another 3 seconds. She said she didn't know. She said she'd come to see him with her own eyes before deciding. With all 6 of them. Dan nodded. He said she could come whenever she wanted. Watch as long as she wanted. He wouldn't hide anything. The only rule of the quiet room was that no one here lies to anyone. Yorain looked at him. Her peripheral vision moved quickly, scanning his face, his hands, his posture. the pulse in his neck. She was looking for a lie. Dan knew that. He also knew she wouldn't find one, because he wasn't lying. She left 10 minutes later. She came back the next day, and the next, and the next. On the fourth day, she brought a broken lighting generator. She sat down on the floor. She took it apart into 46 pieces. She put it back together. It worked. For the first time, the quiet room was lit by a normal, warm light instead of a deathly blue flicker. Yorain looked at Dan. He said thank you. She said that gratitude had no engineering value. Dan laughed. She blinked. All 6 eyes. Then her mouth twitched. She was trying not to smile. She couldn't help it. On the 5th day, she came and said she'd sent an empty report to the Drehan clan. She'd written that the subject was of no interest. A standard man. The anomaly could be explained by a stress reaction. Recommendation? Cease surveillance. She said it was the first time in her life she'd lied to her clan. Dan asked why. Yorain was sitting on the floor amid the parts of a second generator she was repairing, simply because it had come to hand. She said quietly. For the first time since they'd known each other, she spoke quietly. She said that while she'd been sitting here for 4 days straight, fixing things, she'd realized one thing. That no one here had asked why she was fixing the generator. No one had said it was a waste of time. No one had said that an engineer wasn't a real warrior, that her 6 eyes were a deformity, not a gift. She said that in the Dryan clan, every single day of her existence was proof. Proof that she was useful, that she was worth feeding, that she was worthy of bearing the clan's name. Every single day. And here she was, just sitting on the floor fixing a broken lamp. And no one demanded an explanation from her. Dan listened. Kirsha, sitting nearby, listened too. Her yellow eyes were closed, but she wasn't asleep. She was listening. Yorain fell silent. Then she picked up the repaired generator. She turned it on. The room grew even brighter. She said she would stay, that if Dan would let her, she wanted to stay here, not as a spy, not as an engineer, just as Yorain. Dan said that was what the quiet room was for, to just be yourself. Yorain nodded. All 6 eyes blinked at the same time. For the first time in 5 days. In unison. It meant something. Dan didn't know what, but Kirsha, standing nearby, smiled quietly. By the end of the first month, a circle had begun to form around Dan, Kirsha, shadow and shield, silent, loyal, with cracks in her blades and steel in her eyes. Weltara, protector and ally from above, icy, broken, with patterns that faded when she thought of the dead. Yorin, engineer in chaos, quick, loud, with 6 eyes and the first lie of her life told for someone other than herself. 12 regular visitors to the quiet room, guardians, technicians, a cook from the upper-level cafeteria, all with unfinished mutations, all with names that no one ever spoke, all on the edge that Dan could see, a thin, fragile line between surviving and breaking. His job was the same as it had been in Portland, hard, slow, invisible. No heroic deeds, no breakthroughs, just sitting and listening, day after day, name after name, story after story, and hoping that it was enough. On the 34th day, the silence ended. Dan was sitting in the quiet room. Evening. 7 Zirani on cushions along the walls. Kirsha nearby. Yorain was in the corner, soldering something small. The white noise generator hummed at a low frequency. Everything was as usual. Then the floor shook. Not much, like a distant explosion. The generator flickered. The light went out for a second and came back on. Kirsha sprang to her feet instantly. Her blades extended, curved, cracked, but sharp. Yorain looked up. Her 4 side eyes widened. She was listening to the station, literally. Her sensory mutation allowed her to sense vibrations in the structures. She said there was gunfire upstairs. Level 3. The command module. Dan stood up. The 7 Zirani on the cushions rose as well, instantly, without panic. They were warriors. Even the broken ones, even those with incomplete mutations. Their bodies remembered war. 2 minutes later, a voice boomed over the station's intercom. Dan caught half of it. The implant translated the rest. Attack on the station. Unidentified ships. 3 units. Breach of the outer perimeter. Combat alert. All personnel take up positions. Dan exhaled. He'd expected trouble to come from Zor Kane, not from outside, but the Devourers didn't ask for permission. The next 2 hours were chaos. Kolat Prime Station sprang into action like a single, well-oiled machine. Dan watched from the lower levels as female warriors in full combat gear rushed past him. Bone blades, plasma weapons, adaptive chitin armor. 3 meters of fury and discipline. They ran upward, toward the hangars, toward the gun decks. The quiet room emptied in a minute. 7 Zirani had taken up their positions. Kersha remained. Yorain remained. Dan remained. Yorain connected to the station's network via a hacked terminal. Her 6 eyes scanned the data. She reported. 3 Devourer ships, small class. Reconnaissance. They hadn't attacked the station directly. They were probing the defenses, sending out a swarm. Tiny xenomorphs the size of a fist. Thousands of them. They were squeezing through cracks in the hull and starting to gnaw through the wiring from the inside. The station was fighting back. The gun decks were active. The female warriors fought in the corridors where the swarm had broken through. But in the chaos of battle, what Dan had feared happened. Berserk. Somewhere on level 4. A young warrior. Combat stress had exceeded the threshold. The mutation spiraled out of control. She began slaughtering her own. Dan learned of this from Yorain, who had intercepted an emergency communication channel. She said that Command had dispatched an elimination squad. Protocol. A quick death. Dan closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened it again. He looked at Kersha. She was looking at him. She already knew what he was about to do. Her eyes said no. Her hand on the blade said, "If you go, I'll go with you." Dan said to Yorin, he asked for a route to level 4, without the elimination squad. She looked at him with all 6 of her eyes. The side ones darted about. The main ones were motionless. She said he was crazy. Then she displayed the route on the screen. Service tunnels, ventilation shafts, a detour. They ran. Kirsha in front, Dan behind her. The tunnels were narrow, even for Kirsha. She ran crouched down. Her blades scraped against the walls. Dan ran at full height and still barely kept up. His lungs were on fire. 20 points in charisma and 0 in endurance. His body was that of an ordinary person. Skinny, not athletic, tired. They reached level 4 in 9 minutes. The corridor was torn apart. The walls were cracked. The floor was covered in something dark, not blood, a bioluminescent liquid. Traces of a berserker. At the end of the corridor stood a warrior. 3 meters 20, bronze skin, a mutation, bone spikes. They were growing out of her back and shoulders right now, tearing through her uniform, tearing through her skin. She stood with her back to them, banging her head against the wall, rhythmically, heavily. With every blow, the wall cracked. Glowing liquid ran down her back. Footsteps echoed from the side corridors, heavy. The elimination squad was approaching. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Dan exhaled. He stepped out from behind Kershi. She grabbed him by the shoulder. Her fingers were like steel clamps. He looked at her, shook his head. She let go. Slowly. Each finger separately, as if she were tearing pieces of herself away. Dan walked down the hallway, toward the berserker. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the silence between the blows of her head against the wall. He sat down on the floor 3 meters away from her. The same posture, legs crossed, hands on her knees. He spoke, quietly, in Zir. And his accent was terrible. The grammar was non-existent. But the words were correct, the 90 words he'd learned over the past month. He said a name. He said, "Say." He said, "Please." In Ziron, please sounded like Thai war. Literally, I ask without weapons. The warrior stopped banging her head against the wall. She turned around. Her eyes were black. But not completely. Her right eye, there was something else there. A golden ring around the pupil. Someone was still alive inside her. She opened her mouth. A roar burst from her throat, making Dan's ears ring. But behind the roar, he heard a word. One word. Crushed. Distorted. But a word. Ain. Dan repeated it. Ain. The warrior froze. The spikes on her back stopped growing. The blackness in her right eye receded by a millimeter. Dan said, "Hello, Ain. I'm Dan. I won't leave." The elimination squad appeared at the end of the corridor, 4 warriors with plasma spears. The leader spotted Dan on the floor in front of the berserker. She raised her spear. Kirsha stepped out from around the corner. She stood between Dan and the squad. Her curved, cracked blades were raised, not to attack, but to defend. She said one word: wait. The squad leader looked at Kirsha, then at Dan, then at the berserker who stood motionless, staring at the small man on the floor. The squad leader lowered her spear by 1 centimeter. She waited. 3 minutes. Dan was breathing. Ain was breathing. In sync, slowly. The darkness was fading from her eyes. The spikes on her back began to retract. Slowly, painfully. She was wheezing, but she stood her ground. In the 4th minute, her knees buckled. She fell. Not to the floor. Forward. On top of Dan. 180 kilograms of mutating flesh crashed down on a man who weighed 73. Kirsha leaped. She caught her. She held her. Ain lay on the floor, breathing, asleep, alive. Dan lay beside her. Her ribs ached. But they were all intact. Probably. The elimination squad stood in silence. The leader looked at the sleeping berserker. Then she slowly tucked her spear behind her back. She turned to her squad. She said something briefly. The implant translated. She said the berserker had been neutralized without casualties. For the first time in the history of the Kolot clan, after saving the berserker for the 2nd time, Dan's world changed. Not for the better. It became more dangerous. Word of a man who stopped berserkers unarmed had spread beyond Kolot Prime Station within 2 days. The station's communications officers chatted about it. Merchants passed it along. By the end of the decade, Dan was known on 6 of the cluster's 37 inhabited worlds. Each clan reacted in its own way. The Venshar clan sent an official request. Polite. Cold. They wanted to invite Dan for a consultation. That meant they wanted to study him. The Saiken clan ignored the news. They were busy fighting the Devourers on their flank. The Isara clan, Kirsha's home clan, demanded her return. Formally, she was the clan's property, defective or not. When Kirsha heard this, she stood up in the middle of the quiet room, stood up straight, and said that she was a Kerta'an to Dan, and that the clan could come and try to take her away. Her voice was quiet, but her blades were glowing. For the first time since the day Dan met her, the cracks on the blades pulsed with a dim white light. Something was changing in her. Slowly. But it was changing. The Moortail clan had sent 2 agents. Dan learned this from Weltara. She said that Moortail agents weren't diplomats, they were extraction specialists. They come, they take what they need, they leave. If the subject resists, they take parts of the subject. She said this in an even voice, but her patterns glowed an alarming orange. Dan asked what they wanted from him. Weltara said that the Moortail clan wanted to understand the mechanism of his charisma, at the cellular level. That meant they wanted to dissect him. Alive or dead, preferably alive, for the sake of the experiment's purity. Dan sat down. He rubbed his face with his hands. He was very tired. A month without proper sleep. A month on unfamiliar food. A month of constant tension. His charisma only worked when he was in top form. When he got tired, his stats dropped, and he could feel it. The world around him grew dimmer. The people around him became unreadable. The micro-signals he usually picked up automatically vanished into the noise. He became ordinary, small, fragile. He asked Weltar if there was a way to protect himself. She said that as long as he was at Kolot Prime Station, he was under the clan's protection. But it was protection with conditions. The Kolot clan wouldn't go to war with Moortail over a single man. If the pressure mounted, they'd hand him over. Dan nodded. He understood. His value to the Kolot clan was practical. 2 berserkers saved. That's good, but not enough to risk an inter-clan conflict. He needed to become more valuable, or find other allies, or both. He began to think. A map of trust unfolded in his mind like a hologram. Nodes, connections. Who's with whom? Who's against whom? Where the pressure points are, where the cracks are. Weltara watched him. She saw his eyes moving. Left, right, up, down, as if he were reading something invisible in the air. She asked what he was doing. He said he was thinking. She asked aloud. He said, "All right." He said he needed to meet with the Mortail agents. In person. Well, Tara froze. Her patterns flashed red. She said it was madness. Dan said it might be. But he couldn't hide forever. If Mortail wanted to understand his charisma, let them see it up close. On his terms. In the quiet room. Well, Tara was silent for a long time. Then she said she would be there. With security. Dan said no security. Just him. And Kirsha. Well, Tara said that Kirsha wouldn't be able to stop two Mortail agents. Dan said he wasn't going to stop them. He was going to talk to them. The meeting took place 2 days later. The Mortail agents arrived at night. 2 Zirani. 1. 3 meters 60. Skin the color of wet coal. A bone crown at her temples. A full combat mutation set. Blades, spikes, adaptive armor. She moved so quietly that Dan wouldn't have heard her if it weren't for Kirsha, who jumped up a second before she appeared in the doorway. The second agent was smaller, 3 meters. No visible mutations. Which meant the mutation was internal, hidden, more dangerous. The first one stepped into the quiet room. She looked around. Pillows. A wall with faces. Stones in the corner. Warm light generators. Her face betrayed no emotion. The second one remained in the doorway, blocking the exit. Dan was sitting on his pillow. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his hands. He looked at the first agent and saw. Her bone crown wasn't an ornament. It was a neural interface, an organic computer embedded in her skull. She could process information faster than any Zirani, and she was processing him right now, scanning, assessing, cataloging him. But Dan saw something else. Her left eye, her lower eyelid, a micro movement, a rapid twitch, once every 4 seconds. It wasn't a tick. It was a sign of chronic sleep deprivation. She hadn't slept properly in a long time, a very long time. He also saw her hands, powerful, with claws. But her right hand hung slightly lower than her left, compensating for an old shoulder injury. A long-standing one, poorly healed. She was moving through the pain, constantly, every step. Dan spoke up, quietly. He said he knew why they'd come. He said they could take him away. Kirsha tensed beside him. He continued. He said they could take him away and dissect him and examine every cell in his body. And they wouldn't find anything, because his charisma isn't in his cells. It's in 20,000 hours of practice, in 7 years of work, in every conversation, on every rooftop, in every crisis center in a city they'll never see. They could slice his brain into layers. They wouldn't find the skill there, just as you can't find music by taking an instrument apart. The first agent was looking at him, silently. Her crown pulsed. She was processing. Dan said one more thing. He said he could see that her right shoulder was aching, that she hadn't slept properly in decades, that her body was worn out, and that no one in the Mortail clan had asked how she was feeling because extraction agents aren't asked such questions. Silence. Kirsha, standing nearby, wasn't breathing. The second agent at the door stirred, by a centimeter, toward Dan. The first one raised her hand. She stopped her partner. She looked at Dan, for a long time. Then she said one word, a name. Shane Moore. Dan repeated it. Shane Moore. She nodded. She turned. She left. The second one followed her, without a single word. Kirsha exhaled. Dan did too. His hands were shaking. He hid them under the pillow so Kirsha wouldn't see. But she saw. She always saw. She sat down next to him. She didn't say anything. She just placed her enormous hand next to his. Not on top of it, next to it. So he could take it if he wanted to. He took it. Shane Moore returned 9 days later, alone, without her partner, without a weapon, in civilian clothes that barely fit her 3 meters 60 frame. She came to the quiet room at night. She stood in the doorway, silently. Kirsha woke up instantly, her blades extended. The white light pulsed brighter than it had a week ago. She recognized Agent Mortail and stepped between her and the sleeping Dan. Shane Moore didn't move. She stood in the doorway, waiting. Dan woke up because of the silence. Strange. He was used to waking up to sounds. But the silence Kirsha exuded as she stood in her fighting stance was special, heavy. He opened his eyes. He saw Shane Moore. He saw Kirshi in front of her. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, looked at his watch. It was 3 a.m. station time. He told Kirshi that everything was fine. She didn't sheathe her blades. She looked at him. He nodded. Slowly. She sheathed her blades. But she didn't step back. She stayed close, within arm's reach. Shane Moore entered. Every step controlled. Soft. She moved differently than last time. Back then she'd moved like a predator. Now like a creature afraid of crushing something. She sat down on the floor. Not against the wall. In the center of the room. Exposed. Vulnerable. For a warrior of her caliber, it was like undressing. Dan sat down across from her. 2 meters away. Close enough to talk. Far enough that Kirsha could intervene if necessary. Shane Moore spoke. Her voice was low, steady, each word like a stone placed upon another. She said she had sent a report to the Moortail clan, that the target had been destroyed while attempting to resist. The body had been disposed of. No data was recovered. The operation had failed. She said her partner had confirmed the report. She said that because of the operation's failure, she would be demoted. Her clearance would be revoked. She might be sent to the outlying worlds, to the front lines of the battle against the Devourers. She said all this calmly, without emotion, as if she were reading someone else's sentence. Dan asked why she had done it. Shane Moore remained silent. Her bone crown pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like a second heartbeat. Then she spoke. She said that after their first meeting, she returned to the ship. She lay down on her bunk. And for the first time in 15 years, she thought about her shoulder. Not as a tactical limitation, not as a weakness that needed to be compensated for, but as pain. Just pain. The kind she felt every day, and which no one had ever asked her about. She said that the man on the floor looked at her and, in 30 seconds, saw what her clan hadn't seen in 38 cycles. That she was in pain. That she was tired. That beneath the armor, the crowns, and the blades, there was someone who just wanted to sleep and not see the dead in her dreams. Dan listened. Inside him, that voice was screaming again. Professional, cautious. She's one of the 10 strongest warriors in the cluster. She's an extraction agent. She killed people over breakfast. You can't let her get attached to you. You can't become her anchor. If she gets attached and you don't live up to her expectations, she'll either break or she'll break you. The voice screamed. Dan heard it. And he knew the voice was right. And he knew it didn't matter. Because sitting in front of him was a woman 3 meters 60 tall, with a bone crown on her skull and claws that could pierce a ship's hull. And this woman's right shoulder was trembling. And she had come to him at 3 in the morning, alone, unarmed, because he was the only one in this whole damned galaxy who'd asked how she was feeling. Dan said, "Tell me about your shoulder." Shane Moore closed her eyes. The crown stopped pulsing. Silence. Then she began to tell her story. She was 12 cycles old when she was first sent on a mission. To kill a deserter from her own clan, her own cousin. She didn't want to, but an order is an order. She found her cousin at a trading station. Her cousin saw her and didn't run. Her cousin smiled. She said she'd be the one sent. She asked her to do it quickly. Shane Moore did it quickly. A blow to the heart, with her left hand. With her right, she held her cousin by the shoulder. At the moment of the blow, her cousin flinched. She twisted Shane Miner's shoulder out of its socket. An accident. A reflex of a dying body. The shoulder was put back in place, but not properly. It's been hurting ever since. 26 years. Every day. She said she'd never had it fixed, because the pain reminded her of her sister, of what she'd done. It wasn't an injury. It was a punishment she had imposed on herself. Dan listened. Kirsha listened nearby. Her yellow eyes glistened. When Shane Moore fell silent, silence filled the room like water. Dan spoke. He asked what your sister's name was. Shane Moore opened her eyes. She looked at him. She said, "Tane Moore." Dan repeated the name. Tane Moore. Then he said, "We can't bring them back, but we can choose not to pretend they never existed." Shane Moore sat motionless. Her crown flared, brightly. For a second, the entire quiet room was bathed in white light from her crown. Then it dimmed to its normal level. A black tear did not roll down her cheek. Shane Moore was too strong for tears. But her right shoulder, the very one that had ached for 26 years, relaxed. For the first time. It dropped 2 centimeters. She didn't notice it. Dan did. She sat in the quiet room until dawn. She didn't say anything else. She just sat there, breathing. At dawn, she stood up. She looked down at Dan. She uttered a phrase that the implant translated formally. "My life belongs to the one who saw in me not a weapon. That is you." Dan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said he was flattered but couldn't make such decisions right now. That he needed time. That he wasn't saying no, but he wasn't saying yes either. Shane Moore tilted her head. Her crown glinted. She said that time was a luxury warriors usually didn't have. But for him, she would wait. She left. Kersha looked at Dan. He looked at her. She raised an eyebrow, an expression she'd learned from him over the past month. He said it was all complicated. She said she knew. Then she added that Shane Moore was among the 10 strongest warriors in the cluster, and that if Dan accepted her oath, the quiet room would have protection that no any clan could break through. Dan said he didn't want to take someone's life for the sake of a tactical advantage. Kersha looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "You accepted mine." Dan fell silent. She was right. He had accepted her Kirtan vow, knowing that refusal would destroy her. He had accepted it out of compassion, but she made no distinction between compassion and choice. To her, he had chosen her. That was enough. And Shane Moore expected the same. Dan lay down on his pillow. He closed his eyes. He thought that for a guy from Portland who just wanted to finish his burrito, life threw impossible dilemmas his way with frightening regularity. The second month began with 2 problems. The first problem was medical. Dan had broken down. Not metaphorically, literally. His body wasn't built for life on the Zerani station. Gravity on Kolot Prime was 12% higher than Earth's. The air was drier. The food wasn't balanced for human metabolism. He slept on pillows on the metal floor. He worked 16 hours a day. He listened. He spoke. He held on. He breathed alongside those who could not breathe on their own. 20,000 hours of training did not change the fact that he was a sack of bones and flesh weighing 73 kilograms. On the 42nd day, he got up in the morning and fell. His legs gave out. Dizziness. Nausea. Cold sweat. Kersha caught him before he touched the floor. She lifted him like a child. Carried him upstairs. To Weltara. Weltara called the station medic. The medic examined Dan. She said he was suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, mineral deficiency, microfractures in his bones from increased gravity, early-stage muscle atrophy, and nervous strain 3 times higher than normal for any species she knew of. She said that if he continued at this rate, his organs would start failing in 2 decades. Dan lay on the medical cot. The ceiling was floating. Weltara stood over him. 3 meters 40. Her arms were crossed. The patterns glowed a cold blue. She said he was an idiot, that he was acting like a berserker, only instead of a mutation, he was being consumed by his own worry, that he was wearing himself out as if he could be regrown. Dan tried to sit up. He couldn't. He said he was used to it, that he'd worked the same way in Portland. Double shifts, night calls, coffee instead of sleep. Weltara said she didn't know what coffee was, but judging by the description, it was poison, and that Dan was quite the specimen when it came to voluntary self-destruction. Dan laughed. Then he coughed. Then he lay back down. Weltara ordered him to rest. At least 7 days. No female visitors. No de-escalations. No quiet rooms. He would lie there, eat, and sleep. Dan said that 7 days was too long. That they were waiting for him. That there was a line for the quiet room every day. That without him. Weltara leaned toward him. Her face was 30 centimeters away. Bronze skin. Golden patterns. Dark amber eyes with vertical pupils. She spoke 1 sentence. She said that if he died of exhaustion, the line for the quiet room would wait forever. Dan fell silent. She was right. The second problem was Shane Moore. More precisely, the second problem was that Shane Moore had appeared and stayed. And now there were 4 in Dan's inner circle. Kershaw, Weltara, Yorain, and one of the 10 strongest warriors of the cluster, with a bone crown and a history of murders spanning 26 years. They didn't get along. It was both expected and terrifying. Kershaw didn't trust Shane Moore, an agent of the Moortail clan, an assassin, a hunter. Kershaw stood between her and Dan constantly, literally, physically. If Shane Moore entered the room, Kershaw would stand up. If Shane Moore took a step toward Dan, Kershaw would take half a step to block her path. Silently, without aggression, but with the absolute steadfastness of a shield that would not budge. Shane Moore endured it. She was older, more experienced. She understood that Kershaw was not protecting territory, but the only being who had given her a name. But Shane Moore's patience was the patience of a predator, quiet, focused, with her claws tucked behind her back. At the sight of Shane Moore, Yorain fell silent, for the first time. Shane Moore was from the Moortail clan, an enemy. Not the same kind of enemy as Drehan was to Yorain. Different. Colder. The Moortail didn't fight openly. They came at night, and by morning the problem had vanished. Yorain was afraid of Shane Moore. She hid it behind her silence, but her 6 eyes gave her away. The 4 on the sides twitched every time Shane Moore moved, a reflex, to track a threat. Weltara was the only one of the 4 who showed no emotion in Shane Moore's presence, but Dan saw it. Her patterns changed their pulsation rhythm when Shane Moore appeared. Faster, harsher. It was the body language that Weltara controlled the worst. She wasn't afraid of Shane Moore. She was assessing her. Constantly. Just as an interrogator assesses a suspect. Out of habit. Out of profession. Out of instinct. Dan lay on the medical cot for 7 days and thought. His body was resting. His mind was not. 4 Zirani around him. 4 clans. Kolot. Isara. Drehan. Moortail. 4 stories of pain. 4 sets of skills. 4 personalities that, under normal circumstances, would never have found themselves in the same room. His task wasn't simply to survive. His task was to make sure they didn't kill each other. Because if he couldn't find a way to get these 4 to work together, nothing else mattered. Not the quiet room, nor the de-escalation of the berserkers, nor the expansion plans. If he couldn't unite the 4 Zirani, what made him think he could unite the 7 clans? On the 5th day of rest, he summoned them all, the 4 of them, to his medical ward. They came. Kershaw stood by the door, her usual stance. Shane Moore sat against the far wall. She crossed her arms. Her crown pulsed steadily. Yorain took a corner next to the medical terminal. Her hands were already reaching for the wires. A habit. Fixing whatever was nearby. Weltara remained standing, hands behind her back, the posture of a leader. Dan looked at them, then he spoke. He said that in 3 weeks, he would be summoned to Isar Prime. The Council of Matriarchs wanted to see him. Silence. All 4 Zirani tensed simultaneously. Different parts of their bodies. Kershaw, her blades. Shane Moore, her claws. Yorain, eyes. Weltara, back. Dan said he would go, that he had no choice. If he refused, the council would order him to be brought by force. If he went, there was a chance he could negotiate. He said he needed a team, not security, not an entourage, a team. People he trusts, people who trust him. He looked at each of them in turn. Kershaw, loyalty. Weltara, politics. Yorain, technology. Shane Moore, power. He said he knew they didn't trust one another, that each of them had reasons to hate the other's clan, that the history of the cluster was 300 years of precisely that kind of hatred. He said he wasn't asking them to love one another. He was asking them to look at one another for just a minute, not as a representative of a hostile clan, but as a woman who had come to the quiet room because she has nowhere else to go. Silence. Long, heavy. Kershaw was the first to turn her head. She looked at Shane Moore. Shane Moore looked at her. 2 pairs of eyes, Yellow meeting yellow. Kirsha spoke. She said she didn't trust Mortail, but she trusted Dan. And if Dan said that Shane Moore had truly come to the quiet room, then she would stand by her side and wouldn't be the first to draw her blades. Shane Moore nodded. Slowly. The crown flashed for a second. She said she accepted that condition. Yorain raised her hand. All 6 eyes were fixed on Dan. She said she would go with him to Isara Prime, and that if her mother found out she was alive and with Dan, there would be war, and that she didn't care. For the first time in 19 years, she didn't care. Well, Tara was the last one. She stood tall. 3 meters 40 of absolute control. She said her position did not allow her to officially leave the station, but that she'd arranged transportation, documents, a cover story, and that if necessary, she'd stay in touch. Every hour, every minute. She said this in an even voice, but her patterns burned so brightly that Dan could conduct every line on her face. He nodded, said thank you. Well, Tara said that gratitude had no tactical value. Dan smiled. For the 3rd time in this world, said she'd already said that. Well, Tara looked at him. Her mouth twitched, the shadow of a smile. The second in 200 years. Well, Tara's ship was called the Silent Claw, an old reconnaissance cruiser decommissioned from the Kolot combat fleet 12 cycles ago. Yorain had spent 3 sleepless nights at the controls, and it was flying. It wasn't pretty, but it flew. Dan stood by the observation window. Below him, the Kolot Prime station stretched out. Huge, dark, alive. 2,000 Zirani inside, 12 of whom came every day to the quiet room on the lower levels. He'd left the quiet room on Tyros, the guard who'd come second, the one who'd told him about Ion Kai. He explained the rules to her. 1 rule, say their names. That's enough. Tyros nodded. The gray spots on her neck flashed white. She understood. The flight to Isar Prime took 6 days. 6 days in a confined space with 3 Zirani, each of whom was twice his size. The ship had been built for a crew of 5 Zirani. With Dan on board, it seemed spacious. To him. To Kershi, Shane Moore, and Yorain, it was cramped. They were constantly bumping into each other in the corridors. Blades scraped against the walls. Shane Moore's crown caught on the ceiling panels. Yorain cursed every time someone stepped on her tools, scattered all over the engine room floor. The first 2 days were tough. Kirsha and Shane Moore didn't speak. They occupied opposite ends of the ship and moved in such a way as to avoid crossing paths. Dan watched. He didn't interfere. He knew you couldn't force it. Trust isn't a button. It's a process. On the 3rd day, Yorain broke the warp stabilizer. It wasn't an accident. She was upgrading it. She took it apart. She reassembled it in a new way. It worked 30% more efficiently. And then it exploded. Not a big explosion, but the left engine shut down, and the ship began to drift. Yorain stood in the engine room, knee-deep in sparks and smoke, cursing so fiercely that Dan's implant displayed a translation error. Shane Moore appeared in the doorway. She looked at the chaos. She looked at Yorain. Then she walked over silently. She lifted the heavy panel that Yorain couldn't budge on her own. She held it at arm's length while Yorain crawled inside and rewired the circuits. 40 minutes. Not a single word. Only Yorain gave orders from time to time. To the left. Higher. Hold it. Don't move. Shane Moore obeyed. Precisely. Without question. When the engine started, Yorain crawled out from under the panel, covered in grime and with singed eyebrows. She looked at Shane Moore. She said thank you. Shane Moore said, "You're welcome," and fell silent. Because the phrase about the ethical value of gratitude had already been spoken in this crew, and she knew it. Instead, she simply nodded. Yorain blinked all 6 of her eyes. Then she smiled. A small crack in the wall split open. Dan saw it from the bridge through the surveillance camera and smiled too. On the 5th day, Kirsha approached Shane Moore. She was sitting in the cargo bay, cleaning her claws, a ritual, a meditative one. Kirsha sat down beside her, silently. She pulled out her blades. Curved. Cracked. She began wiping them down with a piece of cloth, also in silence. They sat side by side for 20 minutes. Two warriors from rival clans. One broken, the other deadly. Both cleaning their weapons. In silence. It wasn't friendship. It was an acknowledgement. We're both here. We're both here. We're both staying. On the sixth day, Isara Prime appeared in the observation window. A planet. Huge. Reddish-brown. 2 rings of icy debris. 14 battle stations hung in orbit. Each one the size of a small city. The Isara clan's fleet. But not only that. Dan saw ships bearing the symbols of Venshar, Saikin, Kolat. 4 of the 7 great clans had sent representatives. This wasn't just a summons for a consultation. It was a trial. Yorain decoded the communications between the stations. She said that the Council of Matriarchs had convened in full. 7 out of 7. For the first time in 30 years. And there was only one item on the agenda. A man named Dan Carver. Dan stood by the window, looking out at the armada. His hands were steady. His heart was pounding. 62 beats per minute. Kirsha stood beside him, to his left. Shane Moore to his right. Yorain behind him. He said he was ready. Kirsha said they were too. Silent Claw began its descent. The Matriarch's council chamber on Isara Prime had been built 1,000 cycles ago for a being 4 meters tall. The ceiling receded into the darkness 20 meters above. 7 thrones stood in a semicircle. Each was carved from stone native to the clan's homeworld. Black obsidian from Mortail. Red granite from Drehan. White marble from Isara. Kolat bronze alloy. Venshar green jade. Saikin silver quartz. And in the center, an empty throne made of transparent crystal. The throne of the Unifier. The throne of Valen I. No one had sat on it for 1,000 years. The 7 matriarchs took their seats. Dan saw them. 7 gigantic women. The smallest was 3 meters 70. The largest was 420. Zorkane the Unbreakable. She sat on red granite. Her blades were drawn. Her hands rested on the armrests. 4 meters 20 of crimson fury and absolute conviction. Her eyes locked onto Dan the moment he entered the hall. Small, thin, unarmed, unarmored. Wearing a simple shirt that Yorain had altered from a station uniform. 3 others followed behind him. Kirsha, Shane Moore, and Yorain. 3 Zir Ani from 3 different clans. Shoulder to shoulder. The hall buzzed. 100,000 spectators in the stands. Warriors, officials, healers. Everyone was looking down at a man, 1 meter 78 tall, walking across the stone floor towards 7 beings, each of whom could crush him with a single finger. Dan walked. He counted his steps. 112 steps from the entrance to the center of the hall. He knew this because Welterra had sent him a floor plan of the hall, and he had memorized it. He stopped in the center of the semicircle, between the thrones, 10 meters away from each matriarch. Close enough to see their faces. Far enough that they wouldn't feel threatened. Not that he could be a physical threat, but symbolically, distance mattered. Matriarch Isara spoke first, the planet's ruler. 3 meters 90, skin as white as alabaster, veined with blue. She delivered the formal accusation. Dan Carver, a man, a human, allocated 20 points of the formation system to the charisma parameter, an anomalous value, unprecedented. Suspected of manipulating the formation system. Suspected of exerting illegitimate influence over the cluster's warriors. Suspected of undermining the rank system. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. The second accuser. Matriarch Mortail. 4 meters tall. Skin the color of night. No visible mutations, which meant internal ones. She said that the Mortail clan had sent 2 agents to study the subject. Both agents had gone missing. The report of the subject's death turned out to be false. She demanded the agents and the subject be handed over for investigation. Shane Moore, standing behind Dan, didn't move a muscle. Her crown pulsed steadily. But Dan knew that every muscle in her body was now taut as a bowstring. The third, Zorkane. She didn't read out the charges. She simply looked at Dan, then at Yorain behind him. Her daughter, whom she hadn't seen in 5 decades. Who had fled from a mission to kill this very man. Zorkane spoke a single sentence. She said that this man had stolen her daughter from her. The room fell silent. Yorain, standing behind Dan, flinched. He felt it. A slight movement of air. A tremor. Dan waited. Council protocol granted the accused the right to respond after all charges had been read. 4 more matriarchs, Venshar remained silent. Saikin remained silent. Kolat, the representative of Weltara, formally. She read a dry report. The man Dan Carver was taken into the custody of the Kolat clan for study. During his stay, he demonstrated an anomalous ability to de-escalate berserk states. 2 confirmed cases. A statistical anomaly. Requires investigation. The 7th matriarch, Ultar. 4 meters 10. The eldest of the 7. 112 cycles. Her skin was almost transparent. Beneath it, vessels and luminous channels. A mutation had transformed her body into a living map of the nervous system. She did not speak. She looked at Dan. For a long time. Then she nodded. Response time. Dan took a deep breath. Exhale. 62 beats per minute. He began to speak. In Ziranian. His accent was poor. His grammar was shaky. But the words were correct. He'd spent 3 days on the flight memorizing this speech. Word by word, with Kershi's help, who corrected his pronunciation, with Yorain's help, who explained grammar at machine gun speed, with the help of Shane Moore, who listened in silence and once said that his intonation in the 3rd sentence sounded like an insult, and it would be better to change it. He spoke for 22 minutes. He didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He told his story. He told them about Kirsha. About the girl whom the Issar clan had labeled Unit 6-4. About the girl who hadn't the awakening and was written off. About the girl who went berserk because her body was screaming in pain that no one could hear. He said he sat down on the floor in front of her and asked her name, and she answered, and fell asleep, and didn't die. He told me about the quiet room, about the wall with faces, about the stones with names, about the Zirani who came every day just to sit in silence. Because in the entire vast military station, there wasn't a single place where a warrior was allowed to be weak. He told me about the Berserker Plague, about his theory, that it wasn't a disease caused by mutation, that it was a disease of loneliness. 300 years of unlived grief, 300 years of nameless dead, 300 years of bodies processed into biomaterial without ritual or farewell. Grief that no one called grief because the Zirani have no word for it. Only weakness after loss. He said that berserk isn't the end. It's a cry. The final cry of a being that can no longer remain silent, and that instead of listening to this cry, the Zirani had responded to it with spears for 1,000 years. The hall was silent. 100,000 Zirani. Silence. Dan looked at Zorkane, straight at her. 1 meter 78 by 420. He said he hadn't stolen her daughter, that Yorain had left of her own accord. Because for the first time in her life, she found herself in a place where her 6 eyes were not a deformity, but a gift, where her mind was not a tool for the clan, but a part of who she is. He said he'd known Yorain for 8 months, and that in those 8 months, he'd learned more about her than Zorkane had in 19 years. He said, "Would you like me to tell you what your daughter's laugh sounds like when she thinks no one can hear her? Would you like me to tell you what she fears most in the world? Do you want me to tell you what poem she wrote for your 12th birthday but never showed you?" The room held its breath. Zorkane sat on the red granite, motionless, stone-faced, 4 meters 20 of rage and pain. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her hand twitched, the right one, the one that had been resting on the armrest next to the sword's scabbard. A folded sheet of paper slipped out of the scabbard, small, worn. It fluttered downward and fell onto the stone floor at her feet. Yorain saw it from across the hall, her 6 eyes fixed on a single point. For the first time, all 6 on a single object. She recognized her own handwriting. A poem. One she'd written to her mother when she was 12. One her mother had taken away without a word, and which Yorain had believed destroyed. Zorkane had kept it. For 7 years. In the scabbard of a battle blade, closest to her body. Yorain took a step, then another. Then she ran. Zorkane watched her. 4 meters 20. The warrior who snapped spines with her bare hands. She stepped down from the throne, to her knees, before her daughter, before the hall, before 100,000 Zirani. She spoke 2 words. Forgive me. Yorain stood before her mother, tiny, 250. With 6 eyes, all of which were streaming with tears. All 6 of them. She said nothing. She embraced her mother, with a crooked, awkward grip. Her arms were too short. Her mother's body was too big. It didn't matter. Someone in the stands sniffled. Then someone else. Then the sound spread like a wave. Quiet. Deep. Like an earthquake. 100,000 Zirani were crying. Many for the first time in their lives. 3 days had passed since the speech. The council had not reached a decision. This was unprecedented. Usually the council decided within hours, not days. Dana was quartered in the guest quarters on the Isara orbital station. The quarters were the size of his apartment in Portland. To the Zirani, it was a storage room. He slept. He ate the normal food that Nira Vey prepared. He didn't yet know that she would become a part of his life. A healer from the Venshar clan, 3 meters 10. Her skin was emerald green with amber veins. She appeared on the second day. She simply walked into his quarters, uninvited, with a medical bag. She said she'd heard his speech, that she was a biomancer healer, that she could tell from the color of his skin and the rhythm of his breathing that he was emaciated, and that if he wasn't treated, he'd die in 2 or 3 decades. Dan said he'd already heard that from the medic on Kolot Prime. Nira Vey said that the medic on Kolot Prime was a surgeon, not a biomancer. The difference was like that between a butcher and a gardener. She took a vial of thick green liquid out of her bag. She told him to drink it. Dan looked at the vial, then at her. He asked what it was. She said it was an extract from the bark of the Kron Shai tree, an adaptogen for alien biologies. It stabilizes mineral metabolism, strengthens bones, helps the body adapt to alien gravity. Dan asked about side effects. Nira Vey looked at him. She raised an eyebrow. She said the side effect was life instead of death, and that he could refuse if he preferred the latter. Dan drank it. It tasted like liquid earth mixed with honey, disgusting and wonderful at the same time. An hour later, he felt the difference. The dizziness that had become a constant backdrop to his life over the past 2 months receded. It didn't disappear, but it receded. Nira Vey came every day. She treated him. She checked on him. She grumbled. She grumbled a lot. About his diet, about his sleep schedule, about his habit of working himself to the bone, about his inability to say no when someone asked for help. She was the first person to openly argue with him, not out of aggression, out of concern. Tough, practical, with green hands that glowed when they touched his skin. On the 3rd day, he asked her why she was doing this. She fell silent. The amber streaks on her skin dimmed. Then she spoke. She said she'd had 9 students, young healers. She'd taught them for 7 cycles. All 9 had died of the berserker plague over the past 3 years. They hadn't gone berserk themselves. They'd been killed by the berserkers they'd tried to heal, because Nira Vey had taught them how to approach berserkers, to test their healing power, to seek a cure in biology. But there was no cure, because the disease wasn't biological, and her 9 students died because she was looking in the wrong place. She said that when she heard his speech before the council, about grief, about names, about bodies without ritual, she understood. She realized she'd been looking for a cure for the throat when it was the soul that was sick, and that her students died because she hadn't realized what that little outsider had figured out in just 2 months. Dan listened. Then he spoke quietly. He said she couldn't have known, that she'd grown up in a system that hadn't given her the words for what she was feeling, that you can't find a cure for a disease that doesn't officially exist, that she wasn't a doctor who had failed. She's a doctor who realized the truth too soon. It's just that the truth came in the wrong form, and she needed someone from the outside to say it out loud. Nira Vey stood motionless, green skin, amber veins. They were glowing, brightly, like little suns beneath her skin. She said he was a dangerous man. Dan said he'd heard that before. She said no, not like that. Not dangerous like a weapon, dangerous like hope. Because hope, in a world that has forgotten how to hope, is the most destructive thing one can give. Dan said nothing. She was right. On the 4th day, the council reached a decision. 3 matriarchs voted for execution. Zorkane, Mortail, Isara. 3 voted for clemency. Kolot, Venshar, Saiken, and Ultar, the eldest. 112 cycles old. She remained silent throughout the entire session. Then she stood up, 4 meters 10 of translucent flesh and glowing vessels, and spoke a single sentence. She said that 1,000 cycles ago, Valen I had prophesied the coming of a stranger who would hear what the Zirani had ceased to hear. That the prophecy was recorded in the ancient protocols. That this man was not the defendant. He was a guest, and he could not be executed, because he had been summoned. The hall erupted. Shouts, arguments, chaos. Zorkane leapt from her throne, her blades extended to their full length from her forearms, a meter of living bone. She screamed that the ancient protocols were fairy tales and superstitions, that Valen I had been dead for 1,000 years, that policy could not be built on prophecies. Ultar stood calmly. She looked at Zorkane and waited for her to run out of steam. It took 4 minutes. When Zorkane fell silent, Ultar spoke one more sentence. She said that the deciding vote belonged to the clan that had brought the charge first, the Isara clan. The Isara matriarch sat on white marble. She looked at Dan, then at Kirshu, who stood behind him. Kirshu, Unit 6-4, the reject, the one the Isara clan had written off, who now stood tall, with blades that glowed white, with eyes that never wavered. The Isa matriarch said she was changing her vote, 4-3. Dan Carver was pardoned. Zorkane silently sat down on the throne. Her face was stony, but her eyes searched the hall for one face. Yo Rain, who stood behind Dan, next to Kirsch and Shane Moore. 3 Zirani from the 3 clans, shoulder to shoulder, behind one small man. Zorkane looked at her daughter, and Dan saw it. He saw a micro-movement. Her left hand, her little finger. It moved. It reached out, toward her daughter, a millimeter. Then it snapped back. She wanted to reach out, and couldn't. Not yet. Dan remembered. Another node on his map, red, but no longer just dangerous, now also vulnerable. After his pardon, Dan didn't return to Kolot Prime. Not right away. The council granted him guest status in the cluster. Formal, legal. That meant freedom of movement. That meant protection from the clans. Theoretically. In practice, it meant that now it wasn't just 3 clans that wanted him, but all 7. But they wanted him for different reasons. 3 clans wanted him dead. 2 wanted him on their side. 2 were watching. Dan used the first week after his pardon to catch his breath. Literally. Nirave never left his side. Her green hands glowed every morning as she checked on him. The extract from the Kronshai bark was working. His bones had stopped creaking. The dizziness was gone. But the fatigue remained. Deep. Bone deep. The kind that sleep cannot cure. The kind that can only be cured by purpose. He found his purpose on the 9th day after the council. Nirave led him to the lower deck of the Isara orbital station. There was an abandoned trade module there. Empty. Dark. With a panoramic window looking out into space. She said this was neutral territory. Technically, the module didn't belong to any clan. A trade zone. No man's land. Dan looked out at the empty expanse. He looked at the window beyond which the reddish-brown Isara Prime was slowly rotating. He looked at Nirave. She already knew what he was going to say. He said, "Here." The second house of the silent word opened 6 days later. Yorain had been working without sleep. Lighting generators, heating circuits, soundproofing. She transformed the trade module into a space that breathed. Warm light, soft surfaces. Silence that didn't weigh down but embraced. Kersha brought in pillows. Where she got them remained a mystery. Dan suspected she was simply taking them from the cabins of the female warriors, who were afraid to contradict her. Shane Moore set up a security perimeter. Discreet. 3 observation points, 2 traps at the approaches. 1 emergency evacuation route through the technical airlock. Dan said the traps weren't necessary. Shane Moore said they weren't meant for those who came in peace. Dan didn't argue. He'd learned to choose his battles. Nirave became the head of the second house. Not Dan. He couldn't be everywhere. But he could teach others to be what he was. For 3 evenings in a row, the 2 of them sat together. He taught. Not technique. Technique cannot be conveyed in words. He taught principles. First, say the names. Every name is an acknowledgement that this person existed, that they were important, that they weren't just biomaterial for processing. Second, don't treat. Don't give advice. Don't comfort. Listen. Just listen. Because for a being who has never been heard in their life, the very act of being listened to is already healing. Third, don't be strong in this room. Just be there. Because strength frightens those who have come here to hide from a world built on strength. Nirave listened. She absorbed it all. She was a healer. Listening was part of her nature. It's just that before, she listened to heartbeats and breathing and the sound of blood in the veins. Now she was learning to listen to what lay between the words. The pauses, the sighs, the silence that speaks louder than a scream. On the third day, she said she understood. That it was like how she diagnosed an illness. Only this illness was inside, not in the body, in that place for which the Zirani have no word. Dan said that in his language, there was a word for it, soul. Nirave repeated it. Soul. The word sounded strange in Zirani, alien, like a stone lodged in a mechanism. But she remembered it. 3 months later, in the House of the Quiet Word, the warrior women of 2 clans sat together. Venshar and Saiken, side by side, on the same cushions. They were drinking tea. Ziranian tea. Bitter, herbal, with a hint of something like smoke. Dan had taught them the ritual. Not the Ziranian one, the human one. To sit down, to pour, to hold the cup with both hands, to drink in silence, to look at one another. Not as if looking at an enemy, but as if looking at a being who also holds the cup with both hands. For the Ziranians, who had communicated through blades and orders for 300 years, this was a revolution. A quiet one. An imperceptible one, deadly to the old order. The war between Venshar and Saiken had been raging for 80 years. Officially. Unofficially, they'd simply grown accustomed to shooting at each other. No one remembered what had started it. Dan asked both sides. Neither could name a reason. Only the consequences. They killed our people. We killed theirs. They retaliated. We retaliated. 80 years of echoes. 6 months after the house opened, shooting in the disputed territories had dropped by 40%. Not because of a treaty, not because of an order, because the soldiers no longer wanted to shoot at those with whom they'd shared tea just yesterday, with whom they'd sat on cushions, with whom they had spoken the names of the dead. Because it turned out that the dead on both sides were equally dead, and that grief sounds the same on both sides. Well, Tara coordinated from Kolot Prime. She never left the station, but her network of contacts was more extensive than that of any cluster diplomat. 20 years of interrogations had given her knowledge of every dirty secret of every clan, every skeleton in every closet. She used to use this as a weapon, as leverage, as a knife to the throat, now as a tool for negotiation. She knew what everyone feared, and she knew how to turn fear into motivation, not through threats, through understanding. Dan taught her that, not on purpose. It was just that one day she asked how he knew what people wanted. He said that people all want the same thing, to be seen, to be heard, to be important. The only difference is how they express it. Some ask, others demand. Still, others threaten. But behind the threat lies always the same request. Notice me. Well, Tara was silent for a long time after that. Then her patterns flickered, once, brightly, and she said that after 20 years of interrogating 4,000 beings, she had understood for the first time why they had all lied. They wanted to be noticed, even through lies. She organized meetings, communication channels, cover for the houses of the quiet word in territories where their existence would be considered treason. She found the right people, commanders who were tired of the war, female officials who had seen from the inside how the system was devouring itself, healers who had buried too many, mothers who sent their daughters to the front and didn't wait for their return. Each of them became a node in the network, a quiet network, invisible, one that grew beneath the surface of the cluster like a tree's root system. Shane Moore became Dan's shadow. Not like Kirsha. Kirsha was a shield, always by his side, always in plain sight. Her presence was a statement, he is under my protection. Shane Moore was a shadow in a different sense. She would disappear, for days, for weeks, and return in silence, bearing information. Who was planning an assassination attempt? Where? When? How many fighters? What route? What weapons? She neutralized threats before Dan even knew about them. He found out by accident, in the 7th month. When he asked Shane Moore where she'd been for the past 5 days, she said she'd been taking care of a problem. He asked what kind. She said the black market had put a bounty on his head, enough to buy a small planet, thousands of credits. That was more than the annual budget of an average clan. and that she'd visited 3 bounty hunters who'd accepted the contract. He asked what she'd done to them. She said she'd talked to them. He asked if they were alive. She paused. Then she said 2 out of 3. Dan closed his eyes. He inhaled. He exhaled. 62 beats. He opened his eyes. He told her he was asking her not to kill for him anymore. Shane Moore looked at him. Her crown pulsed slowly, evenly. She said she hadn't killed for him. She'd killed for herself. Because that hunter had described aloud what he was going to do to Dan before he died. In detail, with specifics. And Shane Moore couldn't bear to hear it. She said she had 2 options. To walk away and know that this creature was roaming the cluster with such intent in his mind, or to stop him. She chose the latter. Dan realized that the lines between protection and violence in this world are drawn differently, that he couldn't impose his zira or his own ethics, that Shane Moore does what she knows how to do, loves as best she can, protects as she was created to do. He didn't condone the killing, but he didn't push her away. He said he understood, and that he asked her to try talking first. She nodded. Her crown flashed. Briefly, she said she'd try. Then she added quietly. She said that when she sat in the quiet room next to him, she didn't feel like killing. That it was a strange feeling. New. As if someone inside her were turning off a mechanism that had been running non-stop for 38 years. Dan said that's called peace. She repeated the word. Peace. In Ziranian, it sounded like Tai Shen. The silence after a battle. She said she didn't know it could exist outside of battle. Just like that. Dan said it was possible, and that she deserved it. Her right shoulder. That very one. The one that had hurt for 26 years. It no longer hung lower than her left. Nira V noticed. She asked Shane Moore when was the last time she'd felt pain in her shoulder. Shane Moore thought for a moment. She said she didn't remember. Nira V looked at Dan, then at Shane Moore, then back at Dan. She shook her head. She said he was unbelievable. That he healed injuries she, as a biomancer, couldn't reach. Because they weren't in the body, but in the place he called the soul. In the 8th month, what Dan had both been waiting for and fearing at the same time happened. Zorkane arrived in neutral territory, with a combat unit, 50 female warriors of the Drehan clan in full armor, blades drawn, ships in orbit. Formally, it was a visit by a diplomatic delegation. In practice, it was a combat group capable of destroying an orbital station in 10 minutes. She demanded a meeting with Dan, in person, without witnesses. Everyone around Dan said no. Kirsha said no. Her blades had drawn and glowed white. Shane Moore said no. Her crown pulsed with a battle rhythm, red. Nira Vey said it was a trap. That Zorkane knew no forgiveness. That the lost vote in the council was a disgrace she would wash away with blood. Yorain was silent. All 6 of her eyes were closed. When she opened them, she said she knew her mother. That her mother had not come as a diplomat. That her mother had come as Zorkane. And Zorkane solves problems in only one way. Dan listened to everyone, to each one, carefully. Then he said he would go, alone, without guards. Kirsha grabbed his hand, tightly, almost painfully. Her eyes burned yellow. She said one word. No. Dan placed his palm over her fingers, gently. He said he had to go. That if he didn't go out to face Zorkane, then everything he'd said about trust, conversation, and listening would be empty words. That you can't teach the Zirani to be brave if you're hiding behind their backs. Kirsha slowly unclenched her fingers, each one separately, just like that day in the hallway in front of the berserker Ain, as if she were tearing pieces of herself away. She said she'd wait behind the door, that if she heard anything wrong she'd come in, and she didn't care if there were 50 warriors in there. Dan nodded. He went out. The plaza in front of the House of the Silent Word. An open space. A panoramic window into space. Stars. Zorkane stood in front of the entrance. 420, red skin, blades drawn. A meter of living bone, every centimeter sharpened. She could kill him in 17 ways without moving from the spot. Dan knew that. She knew that. Behind her stood 50 female warriors, a wall of bone and plasma and hatred and discipline. Dan sat down on the floor. The same posture. Legs crossed, hands on his knees, palms up. A posture of submission, a posture of trust. The posture of a man who has no weapon and has no intention of looking for one. Zorkane looked down at him. 420 over 1 meter 78. The difference in scale was absurd, as if a mouse had walked up to a tiger and sat down in front of it, looking as if it wanted to chat. Dan spoke, quietly. He didn't repeat what he'd said at the council. He said something else, something new. He said that Zorkane hadn't come to kill him, that if she'd wanted to kill him, she would have sent an agent, like Mortail, quietly, cleanly, without witnesses. But she'd come herself, with a detachment, with ships in orbit. This wasn't an assassination attempt. It was a demonstration. But a demonstration for whom? Not for him. He isn't worth 50 warriors. For herself. She needed to convince herself that she had come from a position of strength, because in reality, she had come from a position of weakness. She came because at the council, she had seen her daughter for the first time in 19 years, and because a poem had fallen from her blade, and because 100,000 Zirani had seen Zorkane the Unbending fall to her knees, and now she doesn't know what to do about it. Zorkane was silent. Her blades were pointed at Dan, motionless, but aimed. 4 minutes of silence. Dan counted the seconds. Out of habit. In crisis situations, you always keep track of time. He continued. He said that Yorain had written her a poem when she was 12, and that Zorkane had taken it. Silently. Without comment. Without praise. Without a single word. And Yorain decided that her mother had destroyed it. That her mother despised her weakness. That poetry was a disgrace to the Drihan clan. But Zorkane kept it. 7 years. In the sheath of a battle blade. Closer to her heart than a weapon. Dan said that this was not the act of a warrior. It was the act of a mother. And that the mother inside Zorkane was alive. Just frightened. Because love, in the world of the Zirani, is considered a weakness. And weakness is punished. And Zorkane has spent her entire life punishing weakness in others. And she cannot allow herself to discover it within herself. Because if she admits that she loves her daughter, everything on which she has built her life, her philosophy, and her clan will crumble. Pain has made us strong. Kindness will kill us. That is her creed. Her wall. And one little poem by a 12-year-old girl stands behind that wall, waiting. Zorkane stood motionless. 420 of the red stone. Then she slowly lowered her blades. She didn't sheathe them in her forearms. She simply lowered them down. To his feet. An ancient gesture. A sign of dignity. One the Zirani hadn't used in 200 years. One that meant, I see you as an equal, not in strength, but in the right to speak. She didn't say a word. She turned. She left. The squad followed her. 50 female warriors. One after another. Like a wave that had receded. The plaza was empty. Dan sat on the floor. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking. He hid them between his knees. It didn't help. The tremor started in his spine, his whole body. Adrenaline, which he'd kept under control for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and which was now breaking through. Yorain watched from the balcony above the arena, all 6 eyes. She saw everything, heard every word. She came down, slowly, step by step, small for a Zirani, 250, azure skin, 4 extra eyes on her temples. She sat down next to Dan, on the cold floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest. All 6 eyes stared at the empty plaza, where her mother had been standing just a minute ago. She was silent. For a long time. Then she spoke. She said her mother had kept a poem. For 7 years. Dan said yes. Yorain said she hadn't known. She'd thought her mother had destroyed it that very day. That she'd hated her mother for it. 7 years of hatred for something that never happened. Dan said that hatred is often love turned inside out. That you can only hate someone who matters. That indifference is worse than hatred because indifference means you don't exist. But hatred means you do. That you occupy a place in someone's mind. That you're so important that you're worth hating. Yorain was silent. Then tears began to flow from her main eyes. Then from her side eyes. 6 streams. Quiet. Soundless. Without sobbing. Just water. The kind that pours out when a dam breaks. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. She who used to speak at the speed of a machine gun. She who filled the silence with words like an engineer fills cracks with insulation. She was silent. And that silence was more valuable than any words. Dan sat beside her. He didn't comfort her. He didn't hug her.
He was simply there.
A small, sweat-drenched, trembling man, beside the azure-eyed girl who was crying with 6 eyes. Two creatures on the floor, on the border between the old world and the new. A year had passed. Then another. Then the third began. Dan didn't count the days. He counted the names. 412. That's how many names he had spoken aloud during that time. The names of the dead. The names of the forgotten. The names of those whom wars had ground down and reprocessed into biomaterial without a farewell. 412 stories. 412 stones on the walls of memory. In the 11 houses of the silent word. Scattered throughout the cluster, from the icy stations of Saikin to the volcanic bases of Drihan. Each house was different. Each grew from the place where it stood. The house at the station Venshar smelled of herbs because Nerave grew living plants there. The house on the Moortail grounds was dark and quiet like a cave because the warriors of that clan were accustomed to darkness and distrusted bright light. The house in orbit around Isar Prime had a panoramic window looking out into space, and the Zirani would sit in front of it for hours, gazing at the stars and calling out the names of those they had lost somewhere out there among those stars. But every house operated by a single rule. Speak the names. That is enough. Over the course of 3 years, the world had changed. Not quickly, not dramatically, quietly, like a river changing its course, a millimeter a day, imperceptible if you look every hour, obvious if you take a step back. Berserk incidents had dropped by 60% in areas where the houses of the quiet word operated. 60%. Nerave presented the statistics. Dry numbers on a hologram, graphs, curves, data. Behind every number was a life that continued instead of being cut short by a spear. The Council of Voices had existed for a year and a half. Not an official body, not a political structure. Just 6 Zirani who sat down at a table and talked. Each represented her own clan. Not formally. Formally, they were outcasts, defectors, and the dead. But each knew her clan from the inside. Illnesses, fears, secrets, desires. And for the first time in their lives, each heard the same things from a representative of another clan and discovered that the illnesses and fears were the same. That the Zirani on both sides of any border feared the very same thing, losing those they loved, and that this love had to be hidden because love is a weakness. Kir Shah sat to Dan's right, always, silent, with blades that over the course of 3 years had healed all their cracks, blades that glowed with an even white light. The mutation was complete, quietly, painlessly, without stress. Just one morning, Kirsha looked at her hands and saw that the blades were even, smooth, whole. She showed them to Dan. He looked. He smiled. He said he'd always known that her mutation had stopped not because she was weak, but because her body didn't want to become a weapon. That when her body stopped being afraid, the mutation found its form, not someone else's, her own. Kirsha looked at her blades, then at him. Her yellow eyes were warm. She wasn't crying. The time for tears had passed. She just stood there, whole, for the first time in her life. Veltara sat to her left. She had changed the most, not on the outside. Outwardly, she was the same. 3 meters 40, bronze skin, golden patterns, an icy gaze. She had changed in the way she spoke. Before, every word she uttered was a tool, a scalpel, a lockpick, a weapon. Now sometimes, rarely but sometimes, she spoke just because. Not for the result, just to say it. One evening, she came to Dan in the quiet room on Kolat Prime. That very one, the first one, the one where it all began. She sat down on a pillow and began to read poetry. Poems from her youth. Poems she hadn't recited in 40 years. Poems she'd considered dead inside her. They were alive. Every line, every sound. She read, and her patterns burned so brightly that the entire room was flooded with golden light. Dan listened. He didn't understand the words. Ziranian poetry was too complex for his level of language proficiency, but he understood the sound, the rhythm, the melody, the pain and beauty woven together. When she finished, he said one word. More. She looked at him, raised an eyebrow. Then she read some more, and some more, until dawn. Valen VII appeared at the end of the first year. 4 meters 10, alabaster white skin, almost transparent. Beneath it, one could see the blood vessels, nerves, and channels through which life flowed. 156 cycles. Formerly dead for 70 years. In reality, she had been living incognito on a border planet. Alone. No entourage, no name, no purpose. 70 years of guilt and silence. She stepped onto the threshold of the third house of the silent word. She looked at Dan and said she'd been waiting for him. She'd been waiting 1,000 years. Or more precisely, her progenitor had been waiting 1,000 years, and she herself had been waiting 70, and that she was tired of waiting. She told him the truth, the whole truth, about the marriage protocols, about the search algorithm, about the psionic net that Valen I had woven into the race's genome 1,000 cycles ago. A net that hummed quietly at a frequency inaccessible to consciousness. That was searching. Across all worlds. Across all races. A being with a specific neural signature. The highest level of empathy coupled with complete readiness for self-sacrifice. Dan Carver died shielding a teenager from bullets on a street in Portland, Oregon. 3 bullets to the chest. His last thought was of a burrito, that act, that specific moment, a body between the shooter and the child, a decision made in half a second without hesitation. It activated the beacon. He wasn't transported to a random world. He was summoned. Valen I knew 1,000 years ago that one day her race would need not a warrior, but a listener. And she prepared a funnel that would pull such a listener from anywhere in the galaxy at the right moment. When Dan heard this, he stood up, silently. He left the house. He walked through the station's corridors, 2 hours, alone. His footsteps echoed hollowly through the empty sections of the lower levels. He was angry. For the first time in 3 years. Truly angry. Not at Valen VII, not at Valen I, at the universe, which had taken his life away. His apartment in Portland. His coffee pot. His corner diner at the intersection of 3rd and Hawthorne. His colleagues. His clients. His weekends when he'd lie on the couch and watch bad TV shows. All of it had been taken away. Not by accident, by design. His death had been someone's plan. Kirsha was following him, 20 paces behind. Not beside him, behind him. She gave him space. But she didn't let him go. She never left him. 2 hours later, he stopped. The corridor ended in a dead end. Beyond the dead end was a window. Small. Round. A porthole. Beyond it, the stars. 37 inhabited worlds. He stood and looked. Then he turned to Kirsha. She was standing 20 paces away, ash gray, her blades sheathed, her eyes yellow, warm. She didn't say a word. She just stood there and waited, just as she had stood 3 years ago in the doorway of his cramped room on Kolot Prime. Just as she always stood, close by, quiet, without demands, without expectations. Just there. Dan looked at her and remembered. The first day, the sorting hall, berserk, black eyes, him on the floor. Tell me your name. Kirsha. He looked at her and realized he would choose it all over again. Everything. Every bullet. Every second of pain. Every night on the metal floor. Every hour when his body was falling apart under alien gravity. Every moment of fear of Zorkane and the agents and hunters. All over again. Because the alternative is a world where Kirsha never heard her name. And Weltara never read the poems. And Yorain never learned that her mother kept the poem. And Shane Moore would not have found peace. And 412 names would have remained unspoken. He returned. He told Valen VII that he accepted the truth. But he did not accept the role. He is not the chosen one. Not a demigod. Not a living artifact. Not the trigger of an ancient prophecy. He is Dan Carver, 29 years old, a former social worker, who simply knows how to listen. Valen VII looked at him. Tired eyes. Eyes that had seen a century and a half. Wars. Betrayals. Deaths. Escapes. Guilt. She smiled quietly. for the first time in 70 years. And she said that was exactly why he was the right one. Because the chosen one who knows he is the chosen one stops listening. He starts preaching. He becomes the one people flee from, not the one they come to. But the guy from Portland who simply knows how to listen, he'll remain true to himself, even when the world around him changes. She revealed the final secret, the most important one. The marriage protocols were not merely a bond between him and the Zerani. They were the genetic key to the race's collective memory. When Dan entered into a true marriage union with one of them, something unlocked in her DNA. A lock that was 1,000 years old. Behind the lock lay memory, the memories of all his female ancestors, thousands of generations, a 1,000-year history, sealed away after an ancient catastrophe of which even Valen VII knew only fragments. Each of Dan's marriages was not merely a union of two beings. It was an act of healing the genetic trauma of an entire race. Kersha was the first. She did not propose marriage, ever. She simply came to him one night when she was 7 months along. As always, quiet, gray, with blades tucked into her forearms. She sat down next to his bed, just like on the first night. She was silent for a moment. Then she said she wanted to sleep beside him. Not for intimacy, just to hear his breathing. Dan looked at her. At the girl he'd saved on the very first day, who'd called him home, who'd stood between him and the whole world for 3 years, who'd never once asked for anything for herself, except this, to sleep next to him, to hear his breathing. He said yes. She lay down beside him, carefully, gently. She'd long since learned to be gentle. 3 years of practice, not a single broken rib since that first time. And that night, something changed. Her blades flashed white, brightly. The room lit up. Her eyes widened. She saw them. Generations of mothers, hundreds, thousands, warrior women, healers, builders, mothers, daughters, names, faces, stories. Ancestral memory flowed through her like a river bursting from a millennia-old dam. She cried until morning. Not black tears of grief, ordinary ones, clear ones. Tears of fullness, like a vessel filled to the brim. She wept and spoke names. Names she had never heard. Names that had always been within her. Locked away. Forgotten. Names that had been waiting. Dan held her hand and listened. Because that was the only thing he knew how to do. And the only thing that was needed. Shane Moore was the second. Weltara was third. Each had arrived in her own way. Shane Moore in silence, with an oath that turned out to be older than she'd thought. Weltara officially, with documents, with seals, with the legal framework she'd built over 2 weeks, and with trembling hands that revealed that beneath the formality lay a woman who'd forgotten how to want and was learning again. Yorain was fourth. She said she wasn't joking. She was serious. For the first time in her life, she was serious. All 6 eyes were fixed on Dan, unblinkingly, without their usual darting, without scanning, just at him. Nira V, the fifth. She wasn't making a suggestion. She was stating a fact. She said they were partners, that it wasn't up for discussion, that she was a doctor, and she could see what he needed and what she needed, and that the intersection of those sets was obvious. Dan laughed. So did she. Each had received a memory. Each had changed. Not into someone else, into someone more whole, more complete. Like a mosaic that had been missing half its pieces all her life, and suddenly they were found. Valen VII had been the 6th, the last, the very last, the most difficult. She came to him 2 years after her arrival, 2 years of observation, 2 years of conversations until dawn on the bridge of Silent Claw, 2 years of quiet friendship between 2 beings who knew what it meant to be alone. She said she didn't deserve this, that she had run away 70 years ago, that she had betrayed her race, that she had known about the disease and hadn't stayed, that every dead Zerani over these 70 years was the price of her cowardice. Dan said one sentence. You've returned now. That means you never truly left. Valen VII looked at him. 156 cycles, transparent skin, glowing veins, eyes that had seen more than any living creature in the cluster. She said, You really believe that? Dan said, I really do believe that. She closed her eyes, opened them. There was something new in them. Not hope. Hope is too fragile a word. A decision. She had decided to return. For real. The third year. The Devourers had come. Not as a reconnaissance mission, not as a probe, as a full swarm. On a scale the cluster had never seen in its entire history. 14 worlds under attack at once. The outlying planets were ablaze. Orbital stations were falling. Refugees were flooding the central worlds. Millions of Zerani on the move. Chaos. Fear. And the old familiar reflex. Every clan for itself. 300 years of isolation. Dan convened the Council of Voices. His 6 women. 6 clans. Racial memory flowed through each of them. 1,000 years of experience. They remembered wars that weren't in the textbooks, tactics that had been forgotten, mistakes that had been repeated 10 times because no one remembered the first time. They knew what any strategist of the cluster knew, because they remembered everything. He contacted the Council of Matriarchs, all 7 of them, including Zorkane. Screens, 7 faces, 7 pairs of eyes. He said one thing, simply, without speeches, without grandstanding. He said that the Devourers would not stop, that on their own, each clan would hold out for a year, 2, then they would fall, that together they were invincible. But to achieve this, they would have to do what the Zerani hadn't done in 1,000 years. Sit down at the same table and listen to one another. Not command, not order, not demand. Listen. Silence. 6 matriarchs were silent. They waited for the 7th. Zorkane the Unbending. Everyone knew that if she said no, the alliance would be impossible. The Drihan were the most powerful military clan. Without them, the fleet would be incomplete. Zorkane sat on red granite. The screen showed a close-up of her face. 420, framed within the hologram. She looked at Dan. Then slowly her gaze shifted, past his shoulder, to Urain, who was standing behind him. Small, azure, with 6 eyes that gazed at her mother. Zorkane spoke. She said that pain had made them strong. That is true, and she does not deny that truth. But she paused, for a long time. Then she said, strength without unity is 7 fists striking at nothing, and 7 mothers burying their daughters, one by one. She said she agreed. The council chamber fell silent. The 6 matriarchs turned toward her screen. Zorkane the Unyielding. She bowed. For the second time. Voluntarily. Consciously. Before witnesses. The united fleet of the 7 clans left the cluster 6 decades later. 14,000 ships. Under a single command. For the first time in the history of the race. Coordination had been impossible. 300 years of enmity. Different communication protocols. Different command languages. Different tactical doctrines. 7 fleets that, just yesterday, were aiming their weapons at one another. Admirals who personally hated one another. Commanders who had lost sisters at the hands of a neighboring clan. And above it all, the Hive. Millions of xenomorphs. A living cloud devouring everything in its path. Dan sat on the bridge of the flagship. In a chair that Urain had customized to fit him, the chair looked ridiculous, tiny in the middle of the enormous command room. Like a child's chair in a general's office. Before him were 7 screens, 7 communication channels, 7 matriarchs, plus 5 admirals on the tactical channel, 12 interlocutors at once. His limit. His absolute ceiling. He wasn't commanding. He was interpreting. Not from language to language, from intention to intention. When Matriarch Drihan said, retreat, she meant a tactical regrouping with a flanking maneuver. When Matriarch Venshar heard retreat, she heard cowardice and betrayal. Dan heard both, and he interpreted. He rephrased. He explained, so that each side understood not the other's words, but the meaning. When Admiral Saiken demanded cover for the evacuation of civilians, and Admiral Mortail refused because it would weaken the strike force, Dan spoke to both of them. He told Admiral Mortail that on those ships carrying civilians were the families of her own soldiers. That if the soldiers found out their families had been abandoned, they would stop fighting. Not out of cowardice, out of grief. And he told Admiral Saiken that Mortail wasn't refusing out of cruelty. That they were calculating the losses. That every ship diverted to evacuation was a gap in the defensive line through which the swarm would break through to those very civilians. That a compromise was needed. A third option. And he found that third option. Every time. For every conflict. 18 hours straight. 18 hours. The battle lasted 18 hours. Dan didn't sleep a single minute. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. His charisma was working at its limit. His voice was giving out. By 10 o'clock, he was rasping. By 2, he was whispering. By 4, Nereve was standing beside him, infusing him with adaptogens directly through his skin. Her palms glowed green. Healing power. She was keeping him on his feet. Literally. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat in a chair and spoke. Kirsha stood to his left, her hand on his shoulder. Warm, heavy, an anchor. Every time his voice began to falter, she squeezed his shoulder. Gently. A reminder. I'm here. You're not alone. Shane Moore stood to his right. Her crown was operating at full power, scanning tactical data, processing it, transmitting to Dan in real time. Coordinates, vectors, positions. She was his second brain, his processor. Yorain was in the engine room, maintaining communications, retuning frequencies when the swarm jammed the channels, fixing whatever broke, swearing so loudly that 3 decks could hear her. Her 6 eyes darted across 12 monitors at once. Weltara coordinated the rear with Kolot Prime. Logistics, supplies, evacuation of the wounded, redistribution of resources among the clans. Her network of contacts functioned like a nervous system. Information flowed, back and forth, without delay. Valen the Seventh sat in a separate cabin, eyes closed, silent, motionless, but not asleep. Her racial memory was at work. She saw battles from 1,000 years ago, formations, maneuvers, mistakes. She saw how the Zerani ancestors defeated enemies more terrifying than the Devourers, and she relayed this to Dan through a secure communication channel, in a quiet voice, steady, with words 1,000 years old. They had won. Not pretty, not triumphant, not like the stories they tell children. Dirty, hard, with losses. 3,000 ships destroyed. Tens of thousands dead. Names to be added to the walls of remembrance. Many names. Too many. But the Devourer swarm had been shattered, scattered, driven beyond the clusters. For the first time in history. For the first time, the 7 clans fought as one. Not 7, 1. After the battle, Dan sat in a chair on the bridge. He couldn't stand up. His legs wouldn't obey him. His hands rested on the armrests. His fingers wouldn't move. His throat ached so badly that every breath felt like swallowing glass. Kirsha sat on the floor next to his chair. Her head was level with his shoulder. He slowly raised his hand. He placed his palm on her head. She closed her eyes. Shane Moore stood to his right. Her crown had gone dark. For the first time, silence in her mind. She reached out her hand. Dan took it. A huge palm with claws that could pierce the hull of a battleship, and a small human hand that couldn't pierce anything. He looked out the observation window. The stars. 37 inhabited worlds, all intact, all alive. He quietly thought to himself that he was a social worker from Portland, and that he had no idea how he'd ended up here, and that he still hadn't finished that burrito. A week after the battle, a meeting was held. Not the Council of Matriarchs, something else, something new. No name, no minutes, no agenda. Around a round table in the first house of the Quiet Word, at Kolot Prime Station, in that very room, with that very low ceiling, with those very walls covered in faces and names, with that very pile of stones in the corner. 7 matriarchs, at a single table, for the first time in 1,000 years. The table was small, ridiculously small. It was designed for creatures the size of Dan. For 7 Zerani ranging from 370 to 420, it was physically absurd. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their knees pressed against the tabletop, their elbows bumped. Zor Kane accidentally nudged Matriarch Venshar with her elbow and nearly knocked her cup over. She apologized, briefly, awkwardly. Matriarch Venshar looked at her, at Zor Kane the Unbreakable, who for 80 years had been the symbol of everything the Venshar clan hated, and she laughed, softly, then louder, and Zor Kane, slowly, against her will, against her very nature, she smiled, and laughed too. For the first time in 80 years of enmity between their clans, someone laughed together. Not at, together. In the center of the table lay the crown of the unifier, an ancient artifact, a transparent crystal shaped like a hoop. 1,000 years ago, Valen I had worn it on her head, the last empress. Valen VII had brought it. She placed it on the table, not on anyone's head, on the table, between the plates of tea and a bowl of something that Niravi called an appetizer and Dan called an unidentified green mass. The crown lay between 7 cups, like a napkin holder, like a household item, like a symbol, not of power, not of grandeur, equality. It belonged to no one. It belonged to the table at which everyone was seated. Dan stood by the wall, not at the table, by the wall, near the door, watching. Kersha was nearby. Shane Moore was nearby. Yorain was nearby. Niravi was there. Weltara was there. Valen was there. 6 women. 6 clans. 6 stories of pain that he had heard. 6 names that he had spoken aloud when it mattered most. The 7 matriarchs were drinking tea. At first, in silence, awkwardly. 7 beings who didn't know how to talk without weapons in their hands. Then one of them spoke. Matriarch Ultar, the eldest. She said the tea was bitter. Matriarch Isara said that in the Isara clan, they brew it with bark, and then it's milder. Matriarch Saikin said that was barbaric, and that proper tea is tea without additives. Matriarch Kolot said that on Kolot Prime, they drink their tea cold. 4 matriarchs began talking about tea. About tea. 7 beings who rule 37 worlds. They were discussing tea, and that was the most important thing that had happened in 1,000 years. Because they were talking. They weren't giving orders. They weren't threatening. They weren't demanding. They were talking. Listening. Responding. Like beings sitting at the same table, drinking the same tea. Dan watched them. Then he quietly backed away toward the door, turned around, left. The hallway. Silence. He took 20 steps, sat down on the floor, leaned his back against the wall, the very same wall he'd leaned against on that first night when Kersha fell asleep by his cot. 3 years ago, right here, on this same level, against this very same wall. He closed his eyes. A smile. A small one. Tired. Genuine. Footsteps. Light. Familiar. Kirsha. She sat down beside him. As always. Silently. She rested her head on his shoulder. Gently. Carefully. She'd learned over the past 3 years. Gentle embraces. No broken ribs. They remained a meme throughout the cluster. Dan's strange human habits. Yorain was still keeping her scientific journal. The latest entry. The subject emits an sound when consuming hot beverages. The study is now in its 3rd year. The function of the sound remains unclear. Updated hypothesis. Ritualistic, Dan said quietly. He said that when he lived in Portland, he had a favorite diner. On the corner of 3rd and Hawthorne. They made burritos with double guacamole there. Huge. Hot. With a spicy sauce that brought tears to your eyes. And that the last thing he remembers from his old life is that he didn't finish his burrito. Because he got up from the table, went out onto the street, saw a young boy. He saw a shooter, and he stepped between them. And the burrito was left on the table, cold, uneaten. And for some reason, it seems to him that this is the most important detail in the whole story. Not the crown of the unifier, not the ancient protocols, not racial memory, but the uneaten burrito. Because it was the last thing that belonged to him, to Dan, not to the trigger, not to the voice of the cluster, not to the husband of 6 warriors, just to the guy who loved hot sauce. Kirsha lifted her head from his shoulder. She looked at him with her yellow eyes, and said she didn't know what a burrito was. Dan laughed, quietly, hoarsely. His throat still hurt after 18 hours on the bridge. He said that one day someday. She said she'd wait. They sat in the hallway, a small man and a 3-meter-tall warrior. Behind the wall, the 7 matriarchs were learning to talk to one another. Stars shone through the observation window at the end of the hallway. 37 inhabited worlds. The devourers cast aside. The berserk plague was retreating. The 11 houses of the silent word glowed with a warm light at 11 stations. The crown lay on the table between cups of tea. Dan Carver, 29 years old,
a former social worker from Portland, Oregon. Husband of 6 warrior women. A man whose voice was heard across 37 worlds. A man who spoke 412 names.
He never became a demigod. He never became an emperor. He never became a living artifact. He remained himself, a guy sitting on the floor, holding someone's hand and listening. Because sometimes, no, always, that's enough.